Everybody under the table.
Afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Wyoming Water Development Commission and Select Water Committee Workshop and Joint Meeting. Today is Wednesday, August 11th, 2021. Can you hear me on this or no? Is it working? Yeah, it is. Okay. We have a couple of announcements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we do the roll call, I just had two quick announcements. The first one, I wanted to introduce the newly appointed Water Development Commissioner, Mr. John Lawson.
Welcome.
Did you want to just give a brief bio of yourself, or?
I can make it real brief. I'm in Casper, Wyoming. I been there since 1989 when I came as the project manager of the North Platte, eventually became the area manager for Bureau Reclamation. And it's hard to believe, because just talking to someone and said, "You'd retired 10 years ago," and it'll be 10 years this December. Background wise, I'm a civil engineer. I'm a registered civil engineer. I started with reclamation and put in over 38 years with reclamation as a design engineer, then a construction engineer in the Dakotas, then head of planning for the water planning for the Bureau of Reclamation over 9 states out of Billings, Montana. And then in 1989, I came to Casper and I finally found a home. So that's kind of my real quick background.
Thank you. Glad to have you here.
Mr. Chairman, just one other announcement. As you're aware, the deputy director and the head of our construction division retired earlier this year. We have replaced that person, and our new person is with us today. Bill Brewer is the new head of our construction division. Bill's been with the department for eight or 9 years. 9 next month, and he's drinking through a fire hose right now, but we're happy to have him in this position, and we'll carry on.
Congratulations. Senator Cayley, can you do the roll call?
Sir. Chairman Glick.
Here.
Vice Chairman Yankee. I'm the secretary here. Commissioner Ensemi Dalton.
Here.
Commissioner Choma.
Excused.
Excused. Commissioner Craig.
Here.
Commissioner Cott.
Here.
Commissioner Little.
Here.
Commissioner Suker.
Here.
And welcome Commissioner Lawson.
Are you, the Select Water, do you guys want to do a roll call?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to pass on the roll call today.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, Director Gebhardt, the financial overview.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll switch places with David so he can have the microphone, but our fiscal manager, David Ray, will present the financial overview.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Ray, I'm fiscal manager for the Water Development Office. So we're going to be in tab A of your notebook today. And the first page, the first couple of pages, these are our annual fiscal projections for water development accounts 1, 2, and 3. We talked about that process briefly during the new commissioner orientation. Just quickly, I'll highlight for you at the bottom of the page, the updated balance available for appropriation Water Development Account 1. That's the amount that we're going to have going into this legislative session to fund projects for new development. So that is $34,077,642. And I will highlight that that is based on future anticipated revenue that we will receive, we're projected to receive over the next biennium, the next 2 years. I'd also like to highlight that out of account 1, that's after we consider those additional non-project admin budget requests. So that would be things like the funding for the border control out of the state engineer's office, our federal match for the SRF program, out of the state engineer's office, the interstate streams program, and then some water quality funding out of the Department of Agriculture, as well as the office's admin budget. So if you flip over to the next page, Water Development Account 2, again, at the bottom of the page, the balance available for appropriation heading into this session for the rehab account, $13,260,730 available for projects. On the next page, Water Development Account 3. At the bottom of the page, you'll see the balance available for appropriation, $32,766,286. And then the fourth page, I just wanted to show you a little bit of history, a trend line over the last 10 years of our annual amounts available for appropriations. So you can see a little bit of a trend on how we've been doing. The red line, that's Water Development Account 2. You can see that's pretty flat. The peaks and valleys are based on our process. So in these even years, when we're preparing the projection, we include the last half of the current budget period, as well as the next 2 full years for the coming budget period. So you see a peak in those even years. If you look at account 3, there's obviously a downward trend there because we had some very specific infusions of money into that account in those years that you see the peaks. If you look at Water Development Account 1, that's the blue line there. This is the one I wanted to draw your attention to. There is a downward trend on this guy, definitely. And I think, what we would say is that's probably related to those non-project admin budget requests, funding from other agencies that is coming out of Water Development Account 1. I really started to see a dip there, and I think it was fiscal year 17 when we started funding the border control for the state engineer's office. So you'll see that steady downward trend there. The next page, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is just a quick financial status sheet that we use for reconciliation of those projections. So it's kind of a double check just to make sure that we balance. So those amounts should match back to the projection sheets. The next item on here, and I'll try to be brief on this. We also every year do an analysis of the water investment accounts and do a 10-year projection for each one of those. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on those. We didn't at this time, after that initial review, we haven't identified any requests for a transfer at this time. So there weren't any excess funds or requirements for a transfer, say, for example, like out of Buffalo Bill reservoir account. So nothing to ask for at this time. We would have probably come in for a transfer from Buffalo Bill to the miscellaneous water account for the annual O&M payment for Seminole to the Cheyenne Board of Public Utilities. However, last year we talked about amending that agreement, and that O&M charge is no longer there. So I'll let Director Gebhardt tag on there if he wants.
Yeah. Thank you, David. I just wanted to point out that as David mentioned, on the miscellaneous water investment account, we used to be responsible for a portion of the O&M, and that was tied to a contract with the Cheyenne Board of Public Utilities to allow us to market some water out of Seminole. And if you remember last year, we went through the process to ask the legislators to change the legislation to allow us to get out of that contract. We worked with the Board of Public Utilities. They were all fine with that as well. So the legislation passed, and then tomorrow, the reason I bring this up, tomorrow we're going to ask for a motion from the commission that to satisfy the law as it was written, that because we haven't sold any water out of that account in 10 years, that we no longer need the account and allows us to terminate that contract. That's per the statute. So we'll be asking for that motion, and then our attorneys will work with the BOPU and their attorneys to come up with an agreement that we can sign to terminate that contract. So I would ask for two motions tomorrow. One is to accept that we haven't used water in the last 10 years. And then the other one would be to authorize the director to enter into that agreement to terminate that ongoing contract that right now it would have extended through 2036. But because of the legislation last year, we're able to get out of it if we determine we don't need it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last thing that I wanted to draw your attention to was out of the Palisades account. We did enter into a new lease agreement with the Idaho Groundwater Appropriators that just started this year. And so that may lead to some additional revenue being available in future years. Lastly, just for your reference, in this analysis of the water investment accounts, on page, about the third page in on that packet, there is a little explanation of each account, gives you a little bit of history of when that started, the original appropriation, the source of the funds, typical expenses and revenue. So just for your reference, if you have any questions there, you can look through that. And then as we get through the rest of the packet, there's detailed information about each account with a 10-year history of the expenses and the revenue in each account. And then our 10-year projection at the bottom of that, along with any notes we have for each account. I won't go through those individually, but I will stand for any questions if the commission has any at this time.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, quick on that, on the transaction history. What I'd like to see is that if it's available, is to get what the balance in each one of those reservoir accounts is, and what the annual income and expenditures for each one of those. So you'd mentioned Palisades. What was the price of the water and how many acre feet did we contract? What is the total we have in that? And then what's our obligated expenditures? And then what's the ongoing balance for each one of those? And maybe that's here, but haven't had a chance to digest that. So.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, there on each detailed account, there is a 10-year history of the by fiscal year, the expenditures and revenue for each one of those years. And then at the bottom of that 10-year history, at the end of fiscal year 2021, you'll see a resulting balance. That's the cash balance as of June 30 of 2021.
That's what each one of these is.
Yeah, so like
Okay, so
Fontenelle's
it's already there.
Yep, Fontenelle, for example, the first one, at the bottom of that, you'll see the balance of $3,971,410.83. That's the current cash balance.
Okay.
And
Mr.
then-
Chairman, if I can have a follow-up. When we get back to and we look at account one, and it just shows under the anticipated revenues, it says other $1.6 million. I'm assuming that's part of the water sales agreement, or what composes the 1.6 that we project in the budget under anticipated revenues under other?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, the other category includes water sales, loan principal and interest, any other miscellaneous revenue that might come into the account. But those are the three primary sources. So loan repayments.
Interest fee under interest, and does interest include principal repayment or not?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, the interest category is investment income. So
Okay. That is the principal and any interest and water sales under other, correct?
yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I may answer your question on the Palisades agreement, I think you had a question on that. This year, we entered into a new agreement with the Idaho Groundwater Association. We had a previous agreement with them. It was a readiness to serve previously. The new agreement is just a flat out water sale of 10,000 acre feet. And the price is set each year as part of the rental pool. There's a calculation that the water district number one in Idaho uses. And so we just tacked on that any water sales would be the same as the rental pool sale price of each year. And I think this year it was $7 an acre foot or $17 an acre foot. And it depends on reservoir, how full it is and projections.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hicks.
on that. What's the length of that contract?
This one currently is 5 years.
5 years with the automatic renewal clause in there? or-
I believe it's an automatic renewal, and it'd be my guess that the Idaho Groundwater Group would be interested in extending that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there are any other questions, if not, I think that concludes my piece of the presentation.
Is there any other questions or any other questions? Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'll stay in my same spot because the next item is the planning contracts consultant selection process, and I'll have Barry give you an update on that.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, Select Water. Pleased to be here to walk you through the consultant selection process this year and where we're at. You're in tab B here. You start with tab B. There's 4 documents there, and we're going to walk through these. First sheet there, you'll see the list of projects. There were 7 projects this year. These are all projects that we already discussed thoroughly at the May meeting. If you remember the joint meeting, we had the sponsors come and talk about these projects. We vetted each of these, and you approved going forward with consultant selection on these projects. And I might also mention in that list, you'll see commissioner assignments there in a couple of the columns, and those have not changed. Those are the original assignments that we made back in May. And so those have been static. We haven't made any changes. That nobody declared a conflict one thing or another. So we're going forward with those. And some of you have already been contacted by some of the project managers. I should tell you that 5 of the commissioners have 2 projects and 4 of the commissioners have 1 project assigned. Since that May meeting, I'm going forward. The projects were advertised, and you can kind of see the timeline here on the bottom part of the sheet. And the way we advertise those projects, they were advertised in the Casper Star Tribune for 4 successive Fridays. They were placed on our agency website. They were also placed on the state procurement site. And then they also were announced through emails to a consultant selection database that we have, an email distribution list. That went on for about a month, such that statements of interest, statements of qualification were due in our office on June 25th at 2 p.m. And we strictly adhered to that deadline. And along with that, along with those statements of interest, statements of qualification, if they claimed Wyoming residency status per the recent statute changes, they submitted a form and did so with their submittal. So those all came in at one time by that deadline. After we had all that information, then the project managers got busy applying the criteria for the statute for selection, 923-105. And there's a whole set of criteria there and how we have to go through and vet these. The goal here is we want to get down to 5 firms if we can. In some cases, we didn't have 5 to begin with, but we tried to get down to the 5 firms on any one project. And in this case, only one project had more than 5 firms come in, and that's the Riverton Regional Project, which actually had 7 firms come in. But again, our goal was to get them down to 5, for which we would send out RFPs and for which we'd get proposals. And even if we had less than 5, those firms, our project managers had to go through what was submitted by those firms to make sure that they were credible, qualified firms to conduct business and so forth and conduct these studies. So from that, we went to a short list, and I think the commission received that short list. It was emailed out on July 18th. That's the second page in your set of documents here. And you'll see the short list of projects and firms still in the hunt. There are actually 20 different submissions still live there. You'll see those 7 projects, again, as we've talked about. Listed there are the RFP number that went out, whether they were shortlisted or not. The prime consultant, obviously some of these have whole teams put together with sub-consultants. the project name, our project manager, and where those firms the prime is based out of. So that's the list, and you were provided that list in July. One of the things I always like to do, and I get some grief in the office about this, I do what I call my factoids. And I'll give you a little bit of summary, and that's on the next sheet, on the third sheet. And you'll see kind of a summary. I think it's really enlightening to go through, see how many consultants have come in, how many projects we've had, and so forth. Here again, this is on the planning side, level 1, level 2 studies. And that first table there, you'll see is broken down into what we call old process and new process. And for some of the new members that might not remember, our old process was that when we were in the legislature seeking funding for the projects, we were also doing consultant selection at the same time. In other words, to make that happen, the project managers in our office, for our years of experience, set the budgets on these projects. So that was what was hardwired into the planning bill. So while you're in the legislature going through and approving the planning bill, at the same time, we're going through doing consultant selection, such that when you get the funding coming out of the backside of the legislative session, then we're halfway through consultant selection. And then at that point, consultants put in their proposals and so forth. The new process, which changed, you see in 2019, it's when that was the break. We were asked by the Commission to Select Water to change it up. They wanted, rather than the office setting the budget on these projects, they wanted to go through the consultant selection process first, and then what the market would bear. In other words, what came out of that selection process, the winning proposer and so forth, and those bids were sealed bids and so forth. But the winner out of that process, the consultant that was selected, whatever they had bid, would then get hardwired into the omnibus planning bill. But to do that, we had to slide the consultant selection up 5 months, okay, to make that all work so that we were done before we got in the legislature. That's the new process. So that's the backdrop here. If you're looking at that table, old process, new process, and you can see number of projects, that's the number of project applications. When we changed things up, there was a drop off, and then we kind of leveled out. And I think this last year, we only had 7 project applications. I think some of that obviously is COVID related. We saw the same thing in our level 3 applications going down. Number of submissions by firms, you'll see, well, this year was 22 different submissions and 16 different firms. And then you can see kind of the trend there. Quite a marked difference from the old way, from back in 2016, 2017, and so forth. Specifically though, 7 projects, 22 submissions, 16 firms, as I said. We can also look at it by project. We had 4 studies where we only had 2 firms come in. I'm pleased to tell you that we didn't have any studies where only 1 firm came in. We at least have 2 on every project. And then we had 1 study where, as I mentioned, the Riverton Regional Project had 7 firms come in. And the average was right about 3 submissions per project. We're down about 1. So, and then you can also look at it by firms. Well, it's kind of interesting to look at it that way. We have 11 firms that are chasing 1 project only, 4 firms chasing 2 projects, and we have 1 firm chasing 3 projects. Okay. And then lastly, I would mention that, as I said, 20 of 22 submissions are still standing. Only 2 were eliminated through the shortlisting process. And also 15 to 16 firms are still standing. Only 1 was eliminated through the shortlisting process. And of all the firms that submitted, they all claim to be Wyoming resident firms, adhering to the residency statutes, filling out the forms and all. So everybody that's still standing are 100% Wyoming firms. So going forward, and actually we can go back to that first page if you don't mind. Bear with me a little bit. So what happened? We came up with a short list. Through that process, as we mentioned, we then sent out RFPs to those shortlisted consultants on that list. That went out Friday, July 23rd. And here again, no budgets were set for those proposals, for those projects and so forth. It's up to the consultant to come up with their budgets and sealed cost proposals. And many of the projects have since had pre-proposal tours. In other words, the project manager went out with the sponsor and held tours around the state on these various projects. I know some of the commissioners were invited to those if they were assigned to those projects, such that the consultants all together would go through and look at the various issues and so forth associated with those projects. From that, then the proposals are being put together. I can tell you that, and that's kind of where we are right now. You'll see that line there on that timeline. That's the big black line is where we are in the whole process. Proposals are now due in our office Wednesday, August 25th at 1 o'clock, which is exactly 2 weeks from today. And then they will then be distributed to the selection teams immediately. And then there's all obviously criteria for proposal rankings and so forth. One of the things that we do look at is per the statutes, we look at previous work previously awarded by the commission to these firms. And also we do collect consultant performance data. That's something new that started in 2016, such that when all these planning projects finish, the project manager fills out a report card basically on every consultant. Okay, so, and that's all a database that we maintain. And that happens both on the planning side and the construction side. So that's a wealth of information that can go into this process as well. The next thing there you'll see, and I've highlighted it for those that will get proposals. Proposal rankings due in the Water Development Office Monday, September 20th at 5 p.m. And if we don't have those, Riley's going to come after you. I'll tell you that right now. We've got to have those proposal rankings. She's shaking her head. Got to have those proposal rankings because we're about, at that point, only a couple of weeks out from interviews. And based on the rankings, they're all put together from the selection teams. And that determines what 3 firms get the interviews. The top 3 firms get the interviews, okay? And so again, Monday, September 20th would be the deadline to get those rankings in. Interviews will then be held Thursday, October 7th, and they're going to be held in Capitol Extension. And I might mention that very last page in this section actually has the consultant interview schedule all mapped out. And you can see that we have 3 sets in the morning and 4 sets in the afternoon. And you can see the teams. I should mention the teams, typically the project manager, 2 commissioners that have been assigned to the project, and then an advisor, which might be a state engineer's office, might be somebody else in our office, construction division, whatnot. And then as well as the sponsor. So typically 5 on each of the teams. We have those interviews. We'll get them all through all those on Thursday, October 7th. And I would encourage our newest commissioner to feel free to sit in on some of these and listen to the interviews and so forth. But right after we get done, we'll come up with a recommendation as to the order of firms to begin negotiations with. And then the next day, which is Friday, October 8th, is the actual commission meeting where the commission will approve the findings of the various selection teams. So that's kind of the process. I would mention last thing about the interview schedule. You'll notice just because of the lay of the land and how many projects we have, there are some commissioners that have some open slots, and you'll see that on the right-hand side there, where you do not need to be here unless you want to participate in some of these and sit in at least. But as far as that's the open slots for the commissioners. And I think that's pretty much it, unless you have anything you want to add.
I did have one thing that I wanted to add. This kind of speaks to longevity. Something new to me in my role here is happened yesterday. And Barry mentioned something new to him was 5 years ago. So just a little jab at you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If there's any questions.
Senator Hicks.
One question, Barry, when we look at the data that you provided on the 7-year summary, the legislature changed the requirements for in-state contractors and contracting. So it would look to me like a lot of that could be explained. That probably had as much or bigger impact last year as the new process. If you've seen that there was firms that are not applying because they don't meet the qualifications under the new in-state preference that the legislature had passed. I know we had quite a robust discussion about that last year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Hicks, I will tell you it a little bit, but not wholesale changes. In other words, a couple of years ago it was 96%. Last year was actually 100% and 100% again. What I have seen is kind of a reposturing of some of the firms. We now have firms that used to prime from out of state are now being subs to primes in state. And I have seen some of that.
That was my next question. If we're seeing that these out-of-state firms are now subbing under an in-state firm. So we are seeing some of that.
A little bit.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Suker.
Question to Barry in regards to what Larry asked. When we get the proposals, the outer state is on the back shelf if we have enough residency proposals to quantify the 3 that we keep in the budget, correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. I will tell you, Commissioner Suker, relative to location, one of the things you'll see in the criteria, it's proximity to the project. And so, I mean, it's location of the consultant, as in proximity to the project, is one of the criteria you can use. But as far as the out of state versus in state, that's already been taken care of in the shortlisting process. And this year they were all in state.
Well, I agree. I think that's an impact too, that might have driven your numbers down. Because if they know there's 3 valid, why would they put their name or spend the money to propose a proposal when they know they're not going to be, even considered under those conditions? So I think that's a big deal.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Suker, I would mention that it used to be if you had 3 credible Wyoming firms. Now, this past year with the legislature and the changes, it is now if you have 1 credible Wyoming firm, you're not allowed to look at out of state. And so we applied that criteria with our staff. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say too. I think
Yeah.
that criteria changed too. So.
Um,
Mr. Chairman. So I've lost my name badge here, sorry. By the way, I make a motion, next year we hold this meeting in Star Valley, just so you know. Mr. Lawrence, I'm a little concerned about just the number of 7 projects, and we're down. Your 7-year summary is interesting to me, with 7 and then the 12 the year before and 13, 7. That's just way, way down compared to 7 or 8 years ago when we were getting 20 and 30 projects. Do you feel like we're satisfied? Are we just simply, we don't have the demand out there out of our communities, or what else do you think is involved in that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Simpson, I would tell you that, obviously there was a change from 2018 to 2019. I think when it went way down from 19, we were pretty much holding the line there, 24, 23, 19. And then you see it really dropped to 7. And what you need to know, that 7, little misrepresentation there, because what happened is, remember, we slid the process up 5 months. So we had just had applications in the fall, and then we had to do them again in March. So it's kind of a double hit. And so that 7 may be a little misleading. But then I thought we were kind of building up again and kind of leveling out. But then this last year, let's face it, we saw it on the construction side, the planning side, numbers are way down. But I do think when you go out and tell the story, and you can never stop telling the story, I've gone out and made those pitches to the irrigation districts, and sure enough, when they find out what we're capable of and what we can do for them, then sure enough, they come in with an application. So a lot of it's education and outreach and letting them know what's available to them.
Senator Hicks.
I would almost think when you look at that data, that part of that reflects the economic well-being of the state of Wyoming. When the mineral taxes aren't flowing in because of coal and oil and natural gas to counties and municipalities because they get part of the sales tax, you're going to just see a decrease because they're still obligated, if they move through the process, for potentially 33% of the project cost by the time they get to construction. So I think it's more a reflection of economic conditions within the state than any other explanation as far as the process. That would be my supposition anyway.
Mr. Chairman, I would add in too, just based on some of the questions that I've received, I also am curious to think that some of these sponsors are worried that we wouldn't have the money also to fund their projects too. We've got a lot of questions. What's happening with you guys? Are you going to have money? So that may play into it as well on this economic discussion. Uncertainty.
Anybody else have any other questions or comments? Director Gebhardt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I'll slide back over into the hot seat. So, Mr. Chairman, the next topic, the tentative contingency account request, this is kind of hot off the press. Inside the front sleeve of your notebook, you should have received a memo. And this just came today, so nobody has had time to look at this. So we'll kind of step through this memo. What we have, this is the Middle Piney Reservoir project. And just this one is a little bit different than our other projects. This is not a sponsor-driven project. This is a water development project where we are the owner, and we have contracted with Stantec to do the engineering on this. And so I mentioned that because it is different. It's not a sponsor coming in. And what we have is a request to use contingency funds. for the project. It's an ongoing project. We're probably 2/3 of the way money-wise spent on it. And I'll explain what this is, but originally, this project was appropriated about $14.2 million. That appropriation allowed for the consulting engineering, the final design, or maybe just construction management. Just construction management. Design was handled in other studies, as well as the construction costs. And also in that appropriation, it set aside $500,000 for the investment. David talked about the investment accounts. This 500,000 goes into a similar one for the O&M on the reservoir. So of that original appropriation, with the 500,000, the construction engineering component, and then the construction itself, we have currently a balance remaining of about $114,000 in that appropriation. And so through the construction, everybody realized going in that this is a tough site. It's a dam built on a landslide. And this project is to rehab the dam that was constructed on top of this landslide to store a little additional water. But more importantly, this dam allows the release for irrigation downstream. So that's kind of the backdrop of the project. And Jason, jump in if I'm missing anything. He's my brains on this. But as we get to the point where we are now during construction, we realize that groundwater is still quite extensive. I think going into it, we had an understanding that there was going to be groundwater. But I think what we found, and even most recently last year, is that there's still a lot of water coming into the site. We finally have everything excavated. We've got the outlet pipe in, the outlet works are in, and we're still seeing a lot of water. So the original plan was to grout along the dam center line, and we've done some of this grouting. But I think what became obvious early this year is that the groundwater is still coming in. We feel that we have slowed the groundwater from the pool through the dam site, but now we're realizing that there's an equal amount of water coming in behind the dam. So a lot of what we're talking about today addresses that. And so the recommendation from the consultant was we still have grouting to do. But the recommendation is to finish the dam, which allows us to put in piezometers and monitoring equipment so that we can determine how much of the groundwater we're seeing is actually coming from the reservoir through the dam, and try to identify how much is coming around the dam. And then the next phase of that is to safely handle the water so that it does not create an issue with the dam. We understand that if it's coming in downstream of the dam through these avalanches and rock slides, that it's probably not going to impact the dam if we can evacuate that water safely. So one of the components of this amendment is to install additional drains downstream on the backside of the dam to evacuate that water. And then also to continue the grouting program after we have a little more information and data that will really guide where we put this grout and how much grout we're going to need in the future. So that's kind of the backdrop of where we are. So in this memo are several items that have been identified that we believe will need to be completed to accomplish this. And I'll go through the first one, seepage control system improvements and site evaluation. So this pertains to adding that additional drain pipe. The purpose of this is to get the water out from under the dam safely so that we're not washing embankment materials downstream. So it's essentially a dam safety function. And so we're asking for $250,000 additional money to accomplish this additional water that we identified. The next item is a kind of a what if. This is a scheduled delay. The purpose of this request for 400,000, because we're finding this kind of real time, we've stopped the engineer, or excuse me, the contractor, until we can reevaluate and do this drainage design. That drainage design is essentially fairly well complete. We've given the contractor kind of a go-ahead on a modified area to work to allow them to continue with the embankment. But the concern we have is if they cannot top out this year with the dam, then they have to remob. And our concern is if they get to that point, in order to minimize potential for claims, we've identified that we may use 400,000 for a change order rather than going to a claim and fighting with the contractor. The next item is riprap placement and management. One of the things that have happened during the construction is as we process materials for the embankment, we end up with a lot more rock. And so there were a couple provisions put in to use this rock in the dam. We've replaced some other import riprap fill as well as some armoring, cable tied concrete armoring to utilize this pile of riprap. What we have though is potentially a leftover pile of riprap that we need to place, and we have a place to put it. It'll be likely to be put on the front face of the dam, but it's a little additional money to place it correctly and not just waste it on site. The Forest Service doesn't want a big pile of riprap, so we're trying to utilize it in the project, and this is the cost of about $20,000 is what we're estimating for that. The next item in this list, roadway erosion repair. This whole area is a tight canyon with a lot of landslides, and the access road is a single access. There really isn't another way into the site. So this request is to help shore up the landslide that impacts the road. I think it occurred again this year. It had to be dug out. But this is to help in perpetuity, maybe not perpetuity, but to prolong the safety of the road and help protect the road. So this is a request of $65,000. The next item is part of the SCADA system. There's still some question on whether this is needed or not, but since we're here, we thought we'd ask for it so we can be nimble. But this is really just to put a repeater in the whole SCADA system, that if a certain SCADA unit, there are multiple units that will read out for telemetry. If this can't read out, then we'll have a repeater that would bounce the signals off so that all of the data that we need from all these different areas can be read. The next item is the control tower ladder update. This is actually a function of changing OSHA requirements. After we bid it, OSHA changed their requirements. We've got a 32-foot ladder inside the outlet works, and then the OSHA required some additional fall protection. So this $10,000 request is to change out the designed ladder with the new one to meet OSHA requirements. The next item is additional instrumentation and monitoring. As I mentioned, we want to take a more informed look at our grouting program. And that's really what this item is doing. We've planned for some additional piezometers and monitoring equipment to help us identify and focus our efforts on the future grouting program. So the ask for that is to accomplish that and install the additional equipment. And then the final item on this is the final grouting work. As I mentioned, our intent is to use the data to focus and be more efficient with our grouting. The grouting, it is being overrun. But I think the consultants came with a good idea to, rather than to come in and just grout. Let's focus it. Let's try to identify where we may have continued seepage that we need to control. And it became very tough when you have all this other water coming in from different directions into the big hole that we had to build the dam. So this concept then is to use the data that we're going to collect after the dam is constructed, come back in and grout through the dam to accomplish this more focused effort on it. And that additional grouting work is $1.7 million. So our ask is to allow us to appropriate contingency account 3 contingency account. We have $10 million in that account. And then to be able to use it up to these limits, and maybe not even up to these limits, but these are a conservative estimate of what we see going forward. But it's just to appropriate some of that contingency account to finish this project that we've got going on. And we really have 2 options to do this. The first one is to request the full amount so that we have everything set up. The second option is to exclude the additional grouting at this time and allow us to collect this data and come up with a better plan and some refined costs and come back to that. So really the option 2 just pulls out the grouting. This will not delay the contractor because this is going to occur next year anyhow. But all of this other stuff we want to be able to set up so that we can keep the contractor going at this point. So I guess the resulting thing that we'll be asking tomorrow is authorization to use the contingency account for one of these 2 options in those amounts. I will say that irregardless of which one we do, we still have to do the grouting next year. So if we choose option 2, we're still pretty committed to needing more money next year for that grouting. But we should have more refined numbers at that time. So that is kind of a very quick introduction to it. I'll open it up to any questions, and I'll mention that Jason is our project manager on it. And we also have folks from Stantec. Victor Anderson is in the audience, as well as Morgan Wardell and Chris Lidstone virtually, that may be able to help answer any technical questions we may have.
Commissioner Suker.
I do have a couple, I guess. One is, are the consultants' fees included in these numbers?
Mr. Chairman, there's about $30,000 worth of consultant fees associated with the 2.725 million. The majority of that 25,000 is associated with the seepage control, the first bullet item there, because they had quite a bit of evaluation and now design to get a handle on what the rates, or what the best figuring on the rates of seepage they were seeing and from the different locations that it was coming from, associated with that. And then there's $5,000 worth of fees associated with the roadway erosion repair to look at the stability of the toe of that berm and everything.
The additional numbers that you have given us are for the construction of
Yeah, the
items.
vast majority of
The
that
vast majority.
is construction.
Okay, that answers that. The other one I had, was there a level 1 study completed on this project?
Mr. Chairman, there's no level 1 study. There was a level 2 phase 1 study and a level 2 phase 2 study completed on this project.
Okay, so what we did, we took the level 2 study and we incorporated into the construction, correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. We also had to go through some permitting. An environmental analysis had to be completed before we got to construction, but
So I guess my real question is, how does that level two study compare with the items that we are now trying to bless for extra work on the project? Were any of these items in that study at all?
Mr. Chairman, there was a significant amount of geotechnical investigation during the studies, both with your traditional drill rigs as well as geophysical testing to get a handle on exactly where the seepage was, what the foundation looked like, what the avalanche or this ancient landslide material looked like. So there were also test pits done, borrow areas for borrow material. Your information is as good as where you actually drill the hole and dig the test pit with a track hoe. So I don't think you can expect to understand, especially this complex of a situation with an ancient landslide like this, to know everything going into the project. So I'm not surprised by the fact that we ran into additional seepage or are talking about more grout.
And I understand that those are unprecedented because, unless you get into it, you probably really truly don't know what you have. But there's some items here. That instrumentation and monitoring for the system, is that totally due to the additional groundwater that was adhered at the time?
Mr. Chairman, I think that is correct. We did have some original, I think we had 9 wells and transducers originally planned. And now that we are seeing seepage coming in, and Riley, if you could bring up that aerial photo again, these guys can get a better handle on what the site kind of looks like, but can you make that full screen? So down is south. And so to the southeast, you can see this large scar. That's basically a mountain. And there's been some more recent landslides. And if I could just stand up, I guess straight to the northeast of the reservoir, that is all landslide material. And now we know, after uncovering the site, we've got a large cutoff trench that was dug basically from the southeast to the northwest in the dam area to provide a cutoff for the seepage from the reservoir. And now that we have that uncovered in that hole, we see seepage coming in from both, mainly now from that southeast side, which is water coming in from that landslide material. And I tried to underlay a topo map, but it doesn't really come through very well. So anyway, the original location of these monitoring wells was not anticipating that additional source of seepage or groundwater, regional groundwater. And so that is more to get a handle on where's the water coming from, to try to figure out the gradients of where the water is. And can we pinpoint, is it coming from the reservoir, around the right abutment? When I say right, that's looking downstream. Or is it coming from this landslide material to the southeast, which is just that large area above and to the right of Brandon's hand there. So some of it was anticipated, but now that we know more, we need more or additional monitoring to get a better handle on where the seepage comes from. And that's going to allow us to better locate where we're going to do this additional grout work and be most efficient with that work.
Jason, I might just add to that I think there's 2 components that we're looking at right now. One is to cut seepage off through the dam. That's the purpose of the grouting. The other seepage, as long as it's not posing a dam safety issue, we're just trying to get rid of that water. So I think there's 2 things going on. The grouting is to keep water from seeping, be able to store water, one, but to also have a safe dam. And then the second one is to just evacuate this, we can consider it nuisance water that's coming into the site from other sources. And I think this was the hardest part to predict, is not only where is it coming from, but the quantity that it is coming into the site.
So one other comment, you probably addressed that, and that's probably what we have, but SCADA, let's look at the SCADA telemetry here. $40,000. Couldn't that be something that we should have found in our exploratory, in our level 2 study, that we're in a canyon, may not have signal at that point? And the other question I had with it, this is a $40,000 extra cost to the telemetry, correct? So what is the original amount of the telemetry that was originated in the contract?
Mr. Chairman, I'll have to rely on the engineers to provide the number on the original amount, but the way this was bid to the contractor, the bid was let, was that it was basically, I believe it was a lump sum item for the SCADA, and it was for the entire package. So right now, the engineers are having conversations with the contractor on what they should have known or not known. And so this is worst what if kind of scenario. And they're planning to come out there here very soon to see if they can actually beam that signal out. But we won't know until they actually do the testing. So that portion of it was put into the bid rather than trying to determine what those signals were in advance through the engineering.
That may not be used, is what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, it may not be needed.
All right, I'm satisfied.
And I will say, just in relationship to the SCADA, this is a very remote site. It's 30 miles west of Big Piney. Big Piney itself is somewhat remote. It's at 8,800 feet. There is no access in the wintertime. And we need to have communications with that reservoir, just like we do with High Savory, to know what our instruments are showing us if we're having any issues throughout the winter, because this is a high hazard structure. If anything were to happen, we have potential for loss of life downstream. So.
Thank you, Jason.
Senator Hicks, go ahead.
Dive in here behind that. This is a discussion that we had last time. A couple of things on this that are a little troublesome, back to the discussion about, you only get what you find, but anybody that's done a lot of geotech work and any reputable firm will go in there and then they'll say, this is what we know, but we always build in a contingency in our bid because we know we don't know what we don't know. We haven't sampled every single site. So I'm assuming that Sandtech would have done that, given their level of experience, but so that's a little bit troubling that wasn't built in. But when we look at the request, if we do the full 2.7 million, that's a 20% increase in the total project budget. Typically, and correct me if I'm wrong, don't we build in a required 10% contingency? So when we submit the estimates for construction costs and consulting engineering costs, then we add a 10% contingency on top of that. So now we're looking at a 30% total increase in contingency in the budget, because apparently we've burned through that 10% out of that 14 million. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, a portion of that, or a good portion of that, was because of this water that we're seeing and the additional effort that the contractors had to go through to keep that site dewatered. Currently they've got 3 10-inch pumps, an 8-inch pump, a 6-inch, a 4-inch. They've got several 200+ kilowatt generators out there trying to keep up with the water. So.
Yeah, and I understand that. And there's always going to be things in a construction project that you don't anticipate, but that's why we require the 10% contingency right off the bat. The thing that I think is most troubling to me, and a question, I guess, is so when Sandtech went in and put the mandatory stop work order to cease embankment fill in place, it's a $400,000. So how many days did it take Sandtech then to come back with a recommendation on how to remediate that? How many days did they stop the contractor from doing work?
Mr. Chairman, I'll start off by saying the Forest Service is the one that put the stop work order on us, because we have a special use permit with the Forest Service to do this project. So they had some concerns. In regards to the timing, I will ask if Stantec would like to respond to that.
How long were they shut down until we come up with a remediation plan?
Yeah,
which is
it's
the extra
difficult to say that
grouting.
they were actually shut down.
Yeah.
It's more of a, what were they planning to do and how did they have to change their plan? Because we wanted to keep that area open to be able to allow the additional drainage pipe to be put in and ordered and get on site and everything else. So instead of them being able to work across the entire site, they were more limited to certain areas, so we wouldn't cover up that work and then have to dig it back out to put the pipe back in. The actual time frame, Morgan with
Yeah.
Stantec, if you want to talk to that real quick.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I appreciate the chance to talk. Mr. Chairman, committee, we appreciate your time too for hearing us out on these items. In regard to the overall schedule of how things progressed out there, in terms of we'll call it the stop work order, that was issued on July 9th. That again, as Jason had mentioned, came in conjunction with the Forest Service. Being the owner of the site and the holder of the permit, they've been watching construction carefully, and along with us and water development had concerns with the amount of water we were seeing from groundwater. And so to summarize, the stop work order from Field Order 5 came through on July 9th. We had a site meeting between Stantec, Forest Service, Water Development, the contractor on July 13th, at which point we discussed some different options and evaluated the site. And then we went back through from Stantec's standpoint, and we approached it from sort of a two-pronged approach. First being coordination with the contractor, knowing that this was a stop work order. The first thought in our head was we don't want to fight this delay. We don't want to hold them up. And so again, we worked carefully with the contractor, with NW at that time, to establish what remaining work they had. At the time, they were working on concrete pours for the conduit. They had other fill areas of the embankment they were working on. They were working on the control structure tower concrete. They were working on the downstream flip bucket. So there was quite a bit of work still in progress at this time. And so we met with the contractor and discussed this with them, and they had felt that, based on the schedule and work they had in front of them, that an August 4th date would kind of be their, for lack of a better term, drop dead date, and at which point they would actually be legitimately delayed from progressing work on the schedule. And so with that in mind, we went ahead and, at the request of Forest Service and Water Development, took a very detailed look at what information do we have from construction observation, what can we determine from previous testing in association with the grouting work. And we gave the site a very thorough review and look over. And that took from from July 13th, by the time we had design memos, recommendations, cost estimates. We had several meetings with Water Development and the Forest Service in the meantime, but we did get a verbal commitment from the Forest Service to commence work on August 5th. And so that was relayed to the contractor, and they started work on fill areas in terms of their, kind of critical path remaining for schedule. They began that work on August 9th, this Monday. So while there, yes, was a delay and a stoppage of work on the embankment fill, there was other work that was being done at that time. And so overall, from the time they were, the August 4th stop date to our August 9th commencement, we had 5 days roughly of overlap there where they were somewhat slowed. Granted, part of that was a weekend where their only operations were screening and crushing. And since then, they've been progressing with toe drain and embankment fill and back onto critical path items in the schedule. And so this delay concern, it's been brought up by NW, but it really is more of a function of, will the embankment be finished by this fall, in terms of their original plan and schedule. Completion of embankment fill was supposed to happen in the fall of 2021, and that's what they are currently working to. And their current schedule shows it should be completed by the end of September, early October. The wild card with this site always is weather and how that plays into their final completion work. But as it stands right now, it appears that should progress on schedule. However, they have brought to our attention that they feel a delay was imparted on them, and they've given us, per the contract, a written notice of that delay. What remains on this item is to see, how does their fill progress? Are they pushing the fill forward in the same schedule and fashion that they had proposed prior to this change? Are their equipment and production rates keeping up with the fill placement rates they'd provided us in the schedule? These are all items we're going to be watching very carefully as construction commences and documents all of these. So that way, if we do get to the point where there's a discussion on delay, we have a very clear picture of how long these adjustments took, what took place during this time for, additional seepage and analysis and remediation. How did work progress beyond that point? Did it follow the schedule? Did we work towards our critical path items? And so that way, as this gets to a point where we have some sort of discussion, we have all the necessary documentation and supporting data to help defend what's going on out there. The reason we've put it in there is that this has been, this is a change condition. And so the contractor felt the claim was warranted. And in our discussions with them, again, their big concern is the mobilization and bringing out additional equipment next spring. And so with that, this one still has, I would say, time to be resolved, and it will take probably more time for us to assess what the full impact to their schedule is and how that's going to play out. The $400,000 estimate is a number that, the contractor had thrown out in discussion in terms of initial estimate of what they anticipated the delay impact to be, but then caveated that very quickly with, well, it all depends on how fast the fill gets in and the embankment backfill progresses. So at this point, we felt it was prudent to bring it up and point out what a worst case scenario would be, knowing that we still have data to collect. We have construction season to complete this work, and we have the contractor moving again.
Mr. Chairman, just a real quick follow up on that. So these are just estimates based that the contractor given. Sandtech is the owner's rep, which the project is the state of Wyoming. So at this point in time, there's been absolutely no negotiations or documentations associated with. This is just what the contractor had said, well, 400,000 sounds like a good number. So where are we at with our owner's rep on here as far as it looks like the recommendation is just to take whatever the contractor has thrown out there without, is it number of days? I know mobilization and all this stuff. So is this just a CYA to have in the budget if we get an early unlikely snowstorm that puts them off?
Mr. Chairman, I guess from an owner's perspective, the way I view this is it is a safety net at this point. We haven't agreed to any potential claims or any delays. At this point, we haven't even realized one yet. But from an owner's perspective, I would rather have the ability to go in and negotiate a change order rather than defend a claim at this point.
Yeah, is there any, is that Morgan still on the phone?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments for Director Gebhardt, Jason, or Morgan? Well, thank you, Mr. Warden. Thank you, Jason. Director Gebhardt.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item on the agenda, I believe, is operating criteria. Under tab C of the notebook is some proposed changes to the operating criteria. The main change that we're proposing is a result of discussions that we had back in December of 2020, and it related to the legislature request to review all application fees and to revise outdated application fees. If you remember, we had a lengthy discussion on the best way to do that. One of them would have required a change of statute. The $1,000 application fee is statutorily required, but there was also a provision that the commission could seek a reimbursement from sponsors for a certain amount of their share of a project. So to answer the request of the legislature at that time, we proposed two options. One would be to change statute. The other would be to capitalize on this other reimbursement fee to essentially accomplish the same thing. That proposal, we discussed it, and the recommendation leaving those meetings was to utilize that reimbursement component to basically increase application fees. And the way that that was done, and I think the motion was at that time was to provide for a tiered reimbursement fee to increase the application fees. And so those changes are reflected on starting on page 8 under chapter 3. And again, this is a result of the memo that we discussed in the Select Water and Commission meeting. Essentially, what we're doing is for level 1 and level 2 projects that are new to the program, they will pay an application fee of the statutory $1,000. And then on top of that, we developed a tiered structure. And that tiered structure is based either on the number of taps or the irrigated acres of an entity. So we developed 3 tiers. The smallest of those tiers on page 9, you can see less than 2,000 taps or less than 9,000 acres for an irrigation company is $1,000. So that $1,000 is on top of the $1,000 application fee. So those entities will pay $2,000 for a new application to our program. The next middle tier is, as you can see in the table, between 2,000 and 9,000 taps or 9,000 to 20,000 irrigated acres. And that requirement would be an additional $2,000 on top of the application fee. And then the largest groups would add on $3,000. That analysis and all was done and previously discussed in previous meetings, and this is a result of that. One thing I would say, so that's on level 1 applications new to the program. This same concept is carried out on page 11. These are applications for level 2 projects. The only difference in this is that our application fees, if it's a continuing study that's already in the program, then we do not require an application fee. So that $1,000 that they did for their level 1 and they're carrying on to a level 2 study, they're not paying a new application fee. We carried that same concept into this additional reimbursement fee as well. So if they've had a project that they're continuing within the last 5 years in the program, then they're not paying a new application fee to the program. So that's the 2 differences in those 2 paragraphs of this proposed criteria change. I'll pause there. Are there any questions on the application fee component to this request?
Do you have any questions or comments for Director Gebhardt,
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner
So
Zucker?
this application is over and above the normal $1,000 application, correct?
Mr. Suker, that is correct. It's an additional 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000. And I'll also point out that this does not apply to level 3 applications. It's only the level 1 and level 2. A couple things statutorily, this reimbursement couldn't apply. It was only for level 1 and level 2. But more importantly, if they're coming into a level 3 project, I would rather them use their money to build it than to pay us an application fee. So that's not included in level 3 applications. That's construction applications. And so the other change that we're requesting, this is a result of some discussion that we heard from the Legislative Management Audit Council. There was some conversations with the Department of Audit and the Department of Revenue where they're having problems getting when they do an audit on some of these entities, They occasionally have problems with those entities getting them all the information they need. After hearing that, there was a comment made in that meeting, something to the effect that if water development did this, then all the irrigation districts in the state would be compliant with the audit. So that kind of pricked up our ears, and we took a proactive approach to that. And we added in the language that added a paragraph with the application that the sponsor must be in compliance with all applicable reporting requirements with the Department of Audit and the Wyoming Department of Revenue prior to its application being considered. This language was taken out of what State Loan Investment Board does currently with all of their applications for funding. So that's the same language. We're imparting it into our application language as well. And I also expect in listening to Management Audit Committee that there will be a draft bill to this effect. So again, we're being proactive. If that bill passes, something we would have to do anyhow. Even if it doesn't, it's cooperating with our sister agency and helping them out. So those are really the two only changes that we're offering. The rest, minor changes to page numbering, an adjustment of the table of contents because of that. And so tomorrow, when we ask for formal motion on this, I'll present two options. The first option is to typically, when we do criteria change, we go out to a public comment, 45-day public comment, and receive public input on these proposed changes. It's not a requirement, but it's typically the way these are handled. Given the nature of these, I think there's an option for the commission to waive that public comment period. I would question if we were to receive public comments on this, would they change our mind? Because this was really an ask of legislature to do this. I believe it kept it out of legislation. I think Select Water chose not to draft a bill to raise our fees because we offered to do this. So I guess my thought would be that even if we got public comment, would we want to not do this anyhow? So the other option then, with that in mind, is we don't have to do the public comment. We can just vote to approve the changes as presented. We would change those in our criteria and we would move on. As an example, Barry did an analysis on the applications that we had this year and thinking about applications new to the program and the size of the entities. We estimated that these changes would have garnered an additional $5,000 or $6,000 in application fees.
Native Larson? Or not Larson, Simpson,
I'll go
sorry,
find my
sorry.
name badge, sorry.
Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Director, I really like what the commission's done with this. I think this is just exactly what we envisioned. So I appreciate your efforts to get us there. I did have one question for you, Director. On page 12, item D, by putting that paragraph in, now we've had a policy internally that when small water districts come and they're in the process of formulating a district, does this D, is that going to eliminate that? And do we need to make a decision one way or another on that, whether we need to have public entities or not? Just make a policy one way or another. But also, does this D prohibit that?
Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that this only applies to an entity if they are under an audit, an ongoing audit with the Department of Audit or the Department of Revenue, and they are not in compliance. If there is no entity and there is no audit, then I don't believe that this has any bearing on them at all. So I believe that this is only if they are under a current audit and not compliant with either of those departments. So it shouldn't matter to a non-entity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Apologize for
Okay, I'll
getting
go
your
find
name
my
wrong.
There we go. Thank you.
I was gonna call you Representative Evan, but I couldn't think of your last name. Um, Commissioner Lisa and Sami Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, just I have a question. Is it the greater of the number of taps or the irrigated acres? I assume it could have 9,000 taps with greater than 20,000. I don't know how these taps work with acreage, to be honest, but should we say it's the greater of, do they pay only, say they have 8,500 taps and greater than 20,000 acres? Do they pay the 3,000 then?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Selmy Dalton, the intent of these two columns, so number of taps refers to a municipality. So when they send in an application, they report how many taps that entity serves. And then the irrigated acres, that's for an irrigation entity. So the number of acres that irrigation entity. So this is either municipal or irrigation.
Mr. Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, a couple of questions and starting back on D, I don't know that we would want to prohibit somebody from applying if they were under an audit. That may just be a formality that they were picked out to do a random audit. It's if they don't come, if they fail their audit, then that certainly would want to do that. That's just a thought. If somebody's being audited, it may not necessarily be because they're not in compliance. It's just a check. So I think we just need to make clear that if it's just an audit or a review, that they would still be eligible to apply. There'd be more than ample time from the time that they applied, from the time that we do the bill, if they come back and they're not in compliance with, Department of Audit finds them out of compliance. That's where we would, but just the application process, I think we would want to clarify that language in there. And then logistically, how does SLIB do this? You'd mentioned SLIB already requires this. So what additional time and steps will this take within the office?
Mr.
For
Chairman,
compliance with that if we put it in there.
maybe I'll propose a change to this language that would cover both those questions. Rather than the language that it is, that prior to receiving funding, the sponsor needs to be in good standing. And I believe that's what SLIB does as well. So we can add the language. We'll work on that tonight to prior to receiving funding from the agency or from the commission, that they need to be in compliance. Would that satisfy both those questions? Okay.
Commissioner Cott.
Mr. Chairman, a question for our Director Gebert. My understanding on this audit thing and is that many districts are required to submit a report every year to the Department of Audit. I don't know if this is something different that we're talking about in item D. And if you don't submit that report, you're in violation of the Department of Audit. Are we on the same understanding there?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just also say that I think the intention of this is they still have the opportunity to get in compliance. We can go ahead and run the bill and appropriate the money. But with this language that they can't receive funding, the money could be sitting there, but they're not going to get that money until they're in compliance. But it still allows them to get in compliance and still have a project and move forward. Just getting them in compliance. Is that satisfy that, Mr.
And I think that addresses that, just given the nature of our protracted application process, that you could literally set somebody back 2 years for some little technical piece of paperwork that they hadn't submitted that could be taken care of after the application process. And I'd hate to exclude those entities. Mr. Chairman, one more question I have on the fee schedule, and it's to kind of take off for Commissioner Anselmi Dalton. So how would you envision that works? We've got the Gillette Madison pipeline, and then we have 50 some water and sewer districts that surround that in Campbell County, and many of those may only have 25 or 30 taps. So when the application comes in from a water and sewer district, but it's to hook on to the Gillette Madison project, that certainly exceeds the So how are we going to make that determination? Is it the water and sewer district that's hooking on, even though Gillette Madison typically sponsors those applications back to hook them on? How are we going to deal with that scenario, knowing that we've got a whole bunch more of these coming?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I think in practice, the way I would view that is just to that point that if it's really serving a special district within a large area, that we would look at that special district, the size of that district that really benefiting from the project.
Just the water and sewer district,
Exactly.
not the everybody, all the taps on the Gillette Madison.
Yeah, the intent.
Or the Rock Springs Green River Joint Powers Board.
Yeah, my intent is not to punish people to apply. The real reason we're doing this is to satisfy a legislative request. And so I would be, in reviewing this, I would be reasonable as to really what is the benefit and who's benefiting from it, and do that way. We had a similar thought because we've got the Dowling application that's in right now. It's actually an application by the city of Laramie, but it's for an irrigation system. So in that instance, I believe we would look at how many acres does that irrigation system serve, not how many taps the city of Laramie has. So to the same point, I think we look at who's benefiting from it and how large are they and what's their ability to, not really their ability to pay, but that's really what it boils down to, is not punish them just because they're a part of a larger system.
Let me ask you about portions of this pipeline that comes out, that runs across the basin, at least on one end of it, they're out of taps. And so what if they come in and applied and said, we want to do an enlargement of a pipeline to bring on 50 more taps? Is it the entire taps again, or is it just the 50 that they're going to add to the system? Because that's an enlargement of an existing system instead of bringing in another district.
I think we would look at who's benefiting, how many people are benefiting, and evaluate it that way. Like I said, the intent is just because it's a big one serving these small districts, not to punish somebody to come in and apply. In practice, I believe that we're going to be very reasonable on how we institute this table. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else have any, Senator Steinmetz?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since we were talking, Director, about legislation, last year we had a bill in the Ag Committee to require the aging irrigation infrastructure survey to be completed before we did funding for the irrigation district. Has that been a part of your discussion at all with funding?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, that was already incorporated into the criteria previously. So that is already in here. And to that point, we do have a presentation on the results of that.
Yes.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? I think we'll take a 10-minute break. Come back at, I can't see what time it is. If you're walking.
It's an easier way to do it than get a bill passed. It's
I know,
like,
right?
hey, why don't you just even a rule?
10 minutes after 3 p.m.
Oh my God.
These teeth out. Blood all over. Killed me.
Solutions, so that's the worst problem then.
Leave
Okay, we're on bulleted item number 7, 2021 irrigation system survey results. Director Gebhardt.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As we just discussed, we did issue the new irrigation survey. And we asked some specific questions on infrastructure, trying to get a gauge on aging infrastructure and what the demands are going to be on the state as part of that for funding and other reasons. Mike Robertson is with us. He and Mabel Jones in our office did and Tony Bergantino over at Words did a tremendous amount of work on this. And they have prepared kind of a summary of it. It doesn't contain everything that we learned, but it does a very good job of pulling out the important pieces. So I will turn it over to Mr. Mike Robertson to give you the results of that survey.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Mike Robertson, Project Manager in River Basin Planning. I have some slides here for this presentation. I also have, it's also in your notebook in tab D, if you'd like to follow along there. So every 2 years, the office conducts a survey of irrigation systems statewide, and this helps gather information to help prioritize, among other things, water development account funds available for planning studies and for construction projects. So the last of these surveys was conducted in 2019. In 2020, there was an interim topic that's been referenced already this meeting from the Joint Ag Committee, and that resulted in a special survey with questions on age and condition of agriculture infrastructure. So these questions are not historically a part of our standard regular survey that we conduct every 2 years. And the River Basin Planning Team previously presented results on that survey at a commission meeting in December of last year. So in 2021, those questions that were on age and condition that were part of the interim topic survey were incorporated into the updated standard survey. So this standard summary report that the office completed is now available on the commission website. But today, what I'm going to present is the results of just a portion of that 2021 irrigation system survey specific to these new questions on irrigation infrastructure age and condition. So the survey responses to these questions were included in this summary report that's available on the website, but the supplemental information that I'm presenting today and these figures is not yet published because this portion is still a work in progress. Okay. Commission maintains a database of contact information for irrigation districts, ditch and canal companies, and other entities that facilitate irrigation efforts in the state. When this 2021 survey was distributed, that included 157 entities. The team of water development staff that worked on this survey made extra efforts to try and improve the response rate by sending out multiple notifications to requesting completion of these surveys. And also about 1 week prior to the deadline, we called individual entities that had not yet responded. So the result of all that effort was that we did increase the response rate relative to previous years, but still reached just 50% of a response rate or 78 entities. So this is something that we'll continue to work on in future years. So what does the 50% response rate represent? It's actually, it represents approximately 2/3 of the lands irrigated by organized entities in the state and 7 of 10 of the largest irrigation entities in the state. those with that irrigate more than 20,000 acres. So although the response rate was just 50% of the irrigation entities overall, the response actually represents a much larger proportion of irrigation infrastructure than that might indicate. So one important note that I wanted to make was that the results of the interim topic survey were presented to the commission in December. There were only 23 respondents at that time. And so at this point, we had 78 responses to a similar set of questions. And so quite a bit more information. And this represents a substantial portion, again, of the larger irrigation entities for the state. Okay, one of the questions on the survey was an open-ended question on the top challenges that each irrigation entity was facing. And the respondents had enough spaces to indicate up to 5 challenges. And these were categorized. In the top 10 concerns are identified here in alphabetical order. Aging infrastructure was among the top 10 and the most common for the larger irrigation entities. Small and medium-sized entities were most concerned about subdivision and urban encroachment, but they also identified aging infrastructure as one of their top issues of concern. Here is a table from the survey results that shows the miles of conveyances and the number of structures that were reported. The table contains a lot of information. It's probably hard to read it, but I'm just going to point out a few of the important observations. First off, the top half of the table breaks out the various types of conveyances that entities could identify, including canals, pipelines, and tunnels. These are reported in miles. And the bottom half of the table breaks out the various types of structures such as headgates, flumes, and pump stations. And these are reported by number in each type. Across the top of the table, we had entities describe the conveyances and structures as part of a system that's either a large, which would be greater than 200 CFS, cubic feet per second. Medium-sized system is considered one with a capacity of 100 to 199 CFS, and smaller entities were those with less than 100 CFS capacity. And then the column on the right is, in bold, is the grand total. So just a quick summary here, we got information on over 3,400 miles of conveyances across the state, and almost 2,400 of those were in large systems. And we got information on over 4,300 individual structures, and 3,700 of those were in large systems. So at the end of the day, we got a lot of information on various irrigation infrastructure components around the state, and much of that does relate to the larger systems. Okay, here's a figure showing the age that was reported for each conveyance on the left in blue and each structure on the right in green. These are reported in categories of 25 years. So we had categories of less than 25 years, 25 to 50, 51 to 75, and those that were 75 years or older. And that's going from left to right. The x-axis here is in miles for conveyances and the count for individual structures. So one of the main takeaways from this figure here is that the majority of conveyances were over 50 years old, and over half of the total miles of those was reported as being greater than 75 years. Structures were generally not as old overall, but there were quite a few in the 25 to 50 year group, and still nearly 40% of the total were greater than 50 years old. Now, if we take a look at the condition information that we collected on the 3,400 miles of conveyances, you can see that there were some differences by size. There's 3 different graphs here of the different sizes of the irrigation systems. And for each graph, the blue represents very good condition, green is good, yellow is fair, orange is poor, and red is very poor condition. So as noted before, there were quite a few, most of the miles were in large irrigation systems, and that's on the left. And the majority of those were reported as being in fair shape, which is the yellow. And under 20% were reported as being in poor or very poor shape. The fewest miles of conveyances were reported in the medium-sized systems in the middle pie graph here. But among these, about 50% were listed as poor or very poor shape. And then finally, the small systems on the right included over 50% reported as being in good or very good condition, and only 16% fell into the lowest two condition categories. So for conveyances that were reported to be in poor or very poor condition, again, those are the ones that we should be concerned about. From large to small systems, we had about 20%, 50%, and 16%. Okay, now this slide shows the reported condition of the various structures by size of the irrigation system again. The majority of the structures, as I mentioned earlier, fell into the large category, and the large green section on the left shows that more than 50% of those were reported in good condition. But there were still 35% that were reported as being in poor or very poor condition. Medium-sized systems in the middle again had the highest percentage of structures in very poor condition at 73%. And the small irrigation systems on the right reported a more even distribution of conditions classes, with just 18% falling into the lowest two categories. So overall, there was a higher percentage of structures that fell into poor or very poor condition compared to conveyances. However, the condition information wasn't necessarily all bad news. We did see a substantial portion of both conveyances and structures that were reported as fair or better condition. In addition to those questions on conveyances and structures, we also asked about reservoirs that contain irrigation water rights, and we found that most were fair or better condition. But out of the 54 total that were reported, 7 fell into poor or very poor condition, and that represents about 13%. Survey also asked about planned projects for each entity over a 20-year planning horizon and the anticipated costs of those projects. So this slide represents planned projects that have already been identified and cost estimates prepared. So we have quite a bit more confidence in the projects in the near term, the 0 to 5 year planning horizon, than those that are, because those are generally more developed. For the timeframes that are further out than 5 years, actual costs are likely to be quite a bit higher than what was reported in the survey. So as you can see here, survey responses indicate planned projects that will cost over $132 million in the next 5 years. And state funding is expected to cover about 69 million of that cost. And then over the entire 20-year horizon, we have those numbers are 173 million and 93 million. So as I mentioned earlier, the response rate includes most of the larger irrigation districts and 2/3 of the land irrigated by organized entities in the state. So we feel like these estimates for the near term are fairly good representation of the expected funding needs for that time frame. Of course, as we get into the longer time frame, this number probably represents more of a low end of what we could expect for those types of projects coming forward. And that's the extent of my presentation today.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, I just was curious, when you look at the condition surveys that you did on the conveyance conditions, there's something that's jumping out on me, so if you look at that, the small ones are, we're over 50% in pretty good shape. Large districts, not quite as high, but certainly better than the medium. Only 3% of the medium is in good shape or something. And then you see the same trend when you get over to structure condition. So under that scenario, you see the large districts are actually in pretty good shape, and the smaller ones are even in better shape. And then again, the medium ones jump out and say, pretty bad shape. So have you given that any thought as to why that is? I mean, I have my ideas, but I'm curious if you guys have kicked it around. And
well, let's see. I would say that probably at least part of that is an artifact of the number of respondents. We had quite a few. The number of structures and miles was much less for medium-sized systems. So one or two responses that indicate some poor quality of the structures or conveyances could really have a strong impact on those numbers. Director.
I do have a guess. I will only call it a guess, but the smaller districts, they may have the manpower and the equipment to handle the maintenance on their facilities. The larger districts, I think they're a little more progressive and are able to obtain funding and do that a little better. And then my guess would be that middle group, they probably have facilities that are a little bit beyond them undertaking large rehab projects, and then maybe aren't utilizing funding that may be available to them, or they may not be able to find funding available to them. That would kind of be my guess as to what's going on.
I guess if I share that, if I was to prognosticate on here, I think you're right on. I think that when you have these small districts, it's usually a group of individuals and they're not delivering a lot of water, and they tend to have the capacity to do the work with a backhoe. Doesn't take a lot of equipment or detailed engineering. The big districts are mostly Bureau reclamation projects. And then you run into that large middle group there that even though they're an organized entity, doesn't mean they're eligible to participate in water development programs. May have a much more hard time because it requires the same level of engineering and construction cost as maybe some a large district, and they can't access the capital. And if I was to guess, I think you're spot on there. A lot of it's just accessing capital and the resources, whether it's capital to hire engineers or otherwise. But it would be good to try to tease that out a little more in any additional, surveys we do in the future, is to try to. I'd be curious as the number of these organized entities that responded, how many of them have historically or have ever participated in water development programs.
I don't know if we have that, or
No, we don't have those numbers.
we can look into it though.
I just think it's something we ought to take a look at, because I think there's a lot of around out there. Given the nature of the structures that can't access state or limited federal programs to help with these. So anyway, if we can tease that data or in the future, I think that'd be good data to have. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Yankee.
Mike, I had a question on your first table there, the challenges faced by irrigation entities. And I know you mentioned that that's listed in alphabetical order, but I was wondering if from the results you were able to determine any type of ranking on that, and whether it was overall or divided up by the size of the entities. If aging infrastructure came out number one, or is there a 1, 2, 3, 4 on any of those things or not?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we did get that kind of information. We initially had a slide that had a bit more of that on there, but we thought it was best not to. Is it in the boneyard? I don't have that on. So, but we did. Sorry. But we did tease out that aging infrastructure is definitely fell out number one for the largest entities and within the top 3 for all groups. So that was definitely, we thought was a meaningful point that I wanted to make with the presentation.
Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a couple of questions, and one of them is, I wondered if you have and you probably do, but what the numbers look like as far as what is the Bureau of Reclamation structure and or conveyance, and what is privately owned. I think that might be important in our discussions too. But also, some structures are more critical than others you can get by with, but if you have a tunnel collapse, then you probably, you don't have many choices. So which are critical infrastructure, as well as ones that could be fairly easily fixed. And so I think those might be some helpful aspects too. But I really want to commend you guys on your work on this. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it. I think it's going to be very important to our state going forward.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? Thank you. Bullet item number 8, small water project program guidance document.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to jump out of the hot seat here in just a second, but the small water project program guidance document was generated to help answer some questions about how do we evaluate projects and really how does the office operate when we're looking at small water applications and how do we institute the program? So we developed a guidance document. Actually, Jody Pavlika developed a guidance document. She's done a really good job. We hope it helps answer some of those questions and minimizes ambiguity and really gives an inside look at how we go through the process of vetting projects. So Jody, if you want to come discuss the guidance document.
Thank you, Brendan. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, and Select Water Committee members, I'm going to try to strike a very delicate balance between going too slow and going too fast. As you can tell, there is a lot of material to cover here. So please, at any time, feel free to jump in and tell me to speed up or tell me to slow down, and we'll get through this together, I hope. So I have gone through the document and tried to highlight the areas that I think are expanding into that area that cover how we handle the operations within the office. And then I will just sort of skip through the sections of the document which are repetitive of the criteria, because we've all covered that on multiple occasions. So I can skip to page 3. The first part there, chapter 1, talks about when the applications are due and program eligibility. We get to that public entity section, the sort of unique piece that I wanted to highlight there. And I tell a lot of these things, I tell my sponsors regularly on the phone, but it probably will be new to some of you guys because you don't necessarily call me as a project sponsor and necessarily work with me directly. So the last sentence there under public entities, the Water Development Office will not allow the project sponsors to apply for projects and then turn over their responsibilities to the landowners. It is my contractual obligation to work with the project sponsors, and it's important for the project sponsors to understand that there is a responsibility for them when they sign that project agreement and they are under contract with us as an agency. So that I guess is sort of like the type of thing that I wanted to cover in this guidance document throughout the different sections, to sort of write some of this stuff down and make sure that there's an easier place for people to find it. Second section there, public benefit. Public benefit of the project must be substantiated by the project sponsor. That is in the legislation, and that is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that's a constitutional requirement by nature of how we put public dollars on private property. And then the last line there is important for the commission to know a responsibility of yours, that if you believe that public benefit as it is written in the recommendation or the application is inadequate, you can then request that the project sponsor testify in front of the commission to sort of back up the public benefit of that project, so that you can be the sort of gatekeepers to the issuance of that fund and make sure that you're getting the information you need before you decide if the funding is appropriate. That next section, estimated total project cost. Is all that comes completely from the project sponsor. So they give us a number. We don't mark that number up. We don't go back and review that number. If I see something in my own mind that I think doesn't pass the straight face test, I may give them a call and say, are you really sure that's where you want this to stop? And then leave it with them to make the ultimate decision. But that last line there, the Water Development Office, specifically the office, cannot authorize additional grant funding for the project after the project application is accepted and approved by the commission at their March meeting. So that's just to let the project sponsors know, if you go over budget, the office cannot write you a bigger check. That's not how this works. So like I said, that's some of the things we're just trying to capture for the sponsors who may be new at this. Next page. There seems to be a little bit of confusion on the application. Section 31 is where we discuss shovel ready and it's called project readiness. That section is only required if you're seeking shovel ready status. If you are not seeking shovel ready status, leave it blank. I do not need it. All I need is the application and the map. And so that was one of the areas of confusion I was trying to clear up here. Page 5. This is, and we'll cover these topics sort of throughout different sections of the document. But if you look under wells and their appurtenances, we then define appurtenances as that may include pumps, power sources, storage tanks, troughs, and other plumbing necessary to make the project function in the manner intended. And then that last sentence there, in most cases, these items are required to put water to beneficial use, which is a prerequisite for payment. So while we may say it is a well project and that designation is probably based on the largest overall expense of the project, that doesn't mean that we're not also buying solar panels and pumps and troughs and all that stuff, because we can't pay you until you're putting water to beneficial use. So therefore, those items are sort of subsidiary to the project. They have to be there or the water can't be beneficially used. Let's see, solar panels, platforms, that 1 second from the bottom there. These projects are frequently bundled, like I mentioned under the wells there. But one thing I did want to talk about a little bit, it like troughs and stuff, even though they're not specifically mentioned here, we fund them because they're required to get the project putting water to beneficial use. But if you look at that last sentence there, larger projects that may need to be phased, such as long stock water pipelines, are eligible for program funding as long as each phase provides a beneficial use of the water when it's complete. So this is written in the criteria, and it is kind of our bridge to nowhere protection. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that term from several years ago. I can drill you a well and put a trough at the well, and that provides beneficial use. I can build you 2 miles of pipeline from that well to a tank and stop it right there, and that provides beneficial use. If you want to come in and connect on to any part of that system to expand it later, that can be its own project. But each project has to provide a complete package when it's done and meet beneficial use, so that if for some reason COVID hits or something, and then all of a sudden money dries up, we still have a functioning system when we're done. So we're just trying to clarify some of these things. That's how we sort of always operated, but it's good to write them down. Page 6, environmental projects. There's a very specific definition here, and this is written in the criteria, but just for the sake of, because we all tend to forget, I think, environmental projects are defined specifically as those that provide for stream bank stability, water quality improvements, or erosion protection. So when we wrote this category several years ago, there was a concern at the time that we'd be opening the floodgates for a whole bunch of whatever rolls through the door at DEQ. And I think while those are very good projects, that wasn't necessarily the intent of the program that we were trying to fund. So we tried to keep a sort of a tight definition on it. But then if you look at the sentence after that, there's a sort of understanding that the projects in this category very often provide multiple benefits that improve not just water quality, but stream habitat as well. So when you're repairing a stream channel and you're putting in erosion protection and you're putting the root wads and the J hooks and the rock structures and that hydraulic design stuff that we do, it improves everything. And it's not just reducing erosion, but it improves the habitat and it improves the channels. And oftentimes those are designed with, pools for the fish to rest in. And I'm going to quickly get over my head as far as out of my depth in that explanation. But wanted to mention that while the primary purpose of the project may be defined according to erosion protection and stream channel, rehabilitation, that doesn't mean that the project itself isn't going to benefit a whole lot broader segment than just that. Irrigation projects is one of the sections where we get probably the biggest questions or different variety of questions. And that is understandable because our criteria basically just says irrigation projects may be eligible. And we have sort of done that on purpose to allow ourselves flexibility to provide recommendations to you that are based on good projects that we feel ought to be constructed. Now, that having been said, we do need to sort of put a little more definition around that for people to help put together good applications to come through the door. So we can skip to those numbers there. On-farm improvements are not eligible. And typically those just have a difficult time meeting the public benefits requirement that was outlined earlier. Ditch to pipe conversions are eligible, but we won't buy you gated pipe because that gets to the on-farm improvements we already talked about. Diversion structures are eligible, including fish-friendly structures, and those are most of what we do, or the rock structures that it's easier, I think, to get funding for those. Obviously, they're more beneficial for habitat, and I think because of that, there are other private partners that are willing to chip in money for that. So we do a lot of those. Those are very good projects. And then a little bullet there about large projects that need to be phased are eligible, provided it meets the requirements we already discussed, where each phase has to provide a beneficial use and stand on its own 2 feet. Rural community fire suppression. This is not a category that we've gotten too many projects on, but we have gotten a few. So we try to limit these applications to the overall greater agency mission. And the overall agency mission being the purpose of supply, transmission, and storage. So that means that the applications that come in for distribution lines or fire hydrants or green area buffer zones, those would be outside of that initial agency mission. So those projects would probably not be recommended, at least from an office's perspective. And of course, any sponsor can come to you guys at the March meeting and have a conversation with you directly. We encourage that. Recreational projects is another category that we don't get too many applications on. They have to meet public benefit standards, like we already described, but also if you had a project and that didn't meet the environmental definitions above, let's say that you were looking for stream channel projects specifically for fish passage or habitat improvement, that's probably where this would land. So then we have a section that talks about ineligible projects or expenses. And these are just sort of ones that we get asked about with some regularity. Cleaning or reshaping ditches is a maintenance issue, not eligible. Plumes and measurement devices are not eligible. On-farm projects, we already talked about. Drinking water projects, kind of beyond the scope of the program. Fencing, we will pay to fence the infrastructure that we install. So we will put protective panels around the solar panels and around the wellhead and that kind of stuff, but we will not pay to fence off your riparian area because that, as you can imagine, can get very expensive very fast. Distribution systems for rural community fire suppression, rehabilitation of a structure that has already been rehabilitated once, and I believe that's in the criteria. The criteria also prohibits the use of funds to refinance completed projects. We cannot augment sponsors' budgets, and that's a question that I was getting early on. And I tell this project sponsors how they accept applications is their business. So if they choose to have an application fee to cover administrative costs, I don't have a dog in that fight, but I cannot pay them for their district's time. Maintenance, of course, is prohibited, and then personal items. And these come in, we have a lot of in-kind projects, and we all know the resourcefulness and the skill set of the Wyoming farmers and ranchers. They can pretty much do whatever they need to do. And frequently that involves receipts and trips to Home Depot. And so we comb through those to make sure that it doesn't include coolers and Christmas decorations and the occasional stuff like that. Okay, on the next page, just to remind everybody, the deadline for applications this year is different. It will be due, and the applications are due November 15th. And the purpose of this was to give us more time and a better understanding of what project demands we're going to be seeing in time to get you a number by your December or January meeting. So I can tell you that I'm actually looking forward to having a little bit extra time this year to get things prepared and to be able to provide you with better than a crystal ball estimate. And so I can hopefully have for you say we got this many applications, and without too much time reviewing each one, I can tell you this is what the rough numbers look like. And so that will give everybody a better handle a little earlier on. Project descriptions. And this goes into a little bit about how we evaluate the project once we come in on the application. It's important for sponsors to put a detail on this, because I will take that detail and I will base my prioritization on that and on cost estimates that are provided with the application. So and we'll get into that a little bit later, but it not just to say we're going to be installing a well and solar and blah, 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 and leave it at that. But if you can tell me how many feet of pipe and, be more specific, then I can utilize that later to help decide where the priority ought to be for that project. And then at the end of that first paragraph there, any project changes that may be requested later in the project are first compared to the project description that was approved by the commission. So largely what I put in the recommendation is a pretty close copy of what comes out of the application for the project description, minus any typos and that kind of stuff. So then we get frequently, oh my gosh, we've got to have a project change because of X, Y, Z. And so the first thing we do before we approve that change request is to go back to the recommendation that was presented to the commission and make sure that we're not getting outside of what it is we told you guys that we would be doing. So that I wrote that. Maybe it's back now. Okay, I wiggled the wire. Maybe that was the right thing to do. Let's see. Okay, then we added that second paragraph there as that was requested. Additionally, sponsors shall identify if the work is to be performed on a project that has already been funded by the Small Water Project Program, and if so, provide the previous project's name, the year the previous grant was awarded, and the total amount of small water funds distributed by the commission under the previous small project. Additionally, the project description shall contain enough detail to describe both projects and why it was necessary to split up the work. It is important to understand that the total amount of all appropriations for the same site shall not exceed $35,000. So we had a request because the criteria says that we can't do the same project location twice, and that's not the exact language, but we had a request that says, listen, if we needed to split this up and we're not spending more than $35,000, does it really matter? And I guess the answer is no, but we need to do a good job of keeping track of, well, this was the first project and we came in for this much money, and now we're going to come back later to add this extra component, and this is why we had to split up the work. And as long as there's a good sort of detail on why that work was necessary, we would certainly present it to you guys in that fashion. And I think so that represents an expansion. We wanted to bring that up for discussion. Let's see, private and state. This is basically just to clarify for the project sponsors that in the application, this item numbers 26 and 27, and that basically says who is the owner of the project and who is the owner of the land. And we've probably covered this in a few other meetings, but try to just let the sponsors know that we're not going to expect it to be okay for you to build a project on your neighbor's backyard without your neighbor at first having to provide us with a letter that says it's okay. That's, we try not to get too legalistic about that, but just to document that in the application is where that typically gets documented. Project partners, that's just basically who is participating on the project, who are the other funding entities, that sort of thing. Project priorities. So we covered this a little bit earlier, but this is where I wanted to do a better job of sort of clarifying how I put each of the different projects into the different priorities. So if we'll look there, right there where it says, please, like the third sentence down, please note that the program priorities are not directly equivalent to the eligible project definitions that were identified in Chapter 2. This is because the project priorities are primarily looking at the purpose of the project and not the project type. And then in order to assign new project applications to a priority, the office relies heavily on the project description, project components table, detailed cost estimates, and the public benefit statements provided with the application. So then we'll continue. As an example, if a stockwater project application is received and the single largest expense is a pipeline, then it's probably going to be classified as a pipeline project. Whereas a similarly named stockwater project whose largest expense is a well would probably be classified as a source water development and classified as a number 1. So I think this is where the biggest source of confusion comes in for a lot of people, because they don't really understand the voodoo that happens on my side of the table and how these things get classified. And typically I try to make it a black and white numbers game. Give me the numbers, let's put it in the project description, and then we'll try to be logical about if there's more pipe than anything else, then that probably makes it a pipeline project. So.
I have a question for you, Jody. On your account priorities, or your account 1 priorities, where it says number 2 storage, it says new small reservoirs. That doesn't include just small reservoirs without being new.
So I guess that would be one of those, like you're proposing to enlarge. Is that what yeah, because that
small one.
Yeah, because that would be, and then adding new storage. So it would be adding additional acre feet of storage. So I would still probably classify that as a account 1 storage project.
Repairing one that's not functional.
That would be account 2. If you look the next one down, there's a storage category under there for rehabilitating existing ponds. And we do a fair number of those too.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Shovel ready. Let's see. Program funding project sponsors may request a shovel-ready classification that is entirely optional and not required. That usually represents a number 1 priority. I believe the language in the criteria says at the commission's discretion. As a project would be ready to start as soon as the contracts are signed and putting the commissions to work sooner. So that means basically that when you apply November 15th, you're ready to begin construction. So then as soon as we get the contract signed, our money can get started going to work on the ground right away. So that of course is, the language says at the commission's discretion, but that's the intent of shovel ready. Let's see, limited funding analysis on those years where we have more demand than we have funds. If you look at that second paragraph there, project application funding will be cut off at an even priority. And I believe we talked about that last December at a meeting. No effort will be made to fund projects in the next highest priority if not all the projects within that priority can be funded. And then so any funds that would be left over would just roll over to the next year, and we would then add it to the next year's projects. So if we can fund up to 3s, but not all the 4s, if we could only fund part of the number 4s, we would just stop at number 3 and not try to parcel it out among the 4s. Project development and construction, next page. Project sponsor can begin construction after the final documents are signed and processed through the Water Development Office. And that usually means that they can begin design or if it's a shovel-ready project, then I can issue notice to proceed, in which case when I get the final documents back from A&I will put a shovel-ready letter in the mail at the same time. So they have their written authorization to go as soon as the documents are ready. The sponsor is responsible for all the planning and design phases of that. I have 100, last I looked, 65 projects. And so I am here for a phone call and to help you work through whatever issues you want to work through, but the heavy lifting has to be on the sponsor side. And then they have to provide documents to me before construction starts. And if you look with that, and we talked about that, notice to proceed is a letter that I send in the mail with the date on top. And that date on top of the letter is what gets locked in as far as any invoices have to be after that time. If the sponsor initiates, you can see to proceed with the project, the sponsor should bear all costs resulting from said action. So we have a few exceptions to that, and I wrote them down, I think probably on the next page. So we have that top of page 12 there, project changes after funding award. The sponsor can call me with any, oh, well, the well needs to go 200 feet deeper. Is that eligible? Or all of a sudden pipe, this happened and we want to do this instead of that. They can call me, and I encourage them to call me with those kind of changes just as soon as they come up, because then I'll write them a quick email and get it in writing so that we don't have to worry about 6 months later when the bill comes in trying to remember what it was we decided. And they've got it on record and I've got it on record that we made a change. Now, that having been said, that second paragraph there reiterates what we already saw in a previous chapter. Before we will agree to that, usually Barry and I sit down and we'll have the recommendation in front of us and we'll have the request in front of us and we'll say, okay, this is what we said, we told the commission we would do, and this is the requested change. And does that go outside of what we told the commission we would do? And if the answer to that is yes, then we'll come to you and we'll request a change of project description by the commission, just to make sure that we're not coloring outside the lines. If the answer is no, then, well, 200 feet deep, it's still a well project. You guys go ahead and that kind of stuff we'll go ahead and authorize and give them an email for it. Certification of completed projects. That usually means that I need signed as-built drawings or a letter of certification from, and this is in the criteria, I believe, a letter of certification from an engineer or a letter of certification from a federal agency. Basically, we need somebody to go review the project and sign off that it's been constructed in the manner, functioning in the manner that it's intended. So that is required before I can issue payment. Project timeline. Basically, that stuff's all standard. I can let you guys go through that at your leisure, but 5A, there's that one of those exceptions on the notice to proceed stuff. Project sponsors may, however, with acceptable documentation, purchase off-the-shelf materials such as pipes and troughs in advance of the notice to proceed letter, as long as they are willing to accept the risk that if the plans are changed by the final plan review and the purchase of materials is no longer required, they are solely responsible for the cost. So many of us here are familiar with rural Wyoming and the understanding there is not a Home Depot on every corner. So this came up, I think, in the Thunder Basin initially, because they were doing so many stock water projects out there that their delivery charge to have the tire tanks was significant. So they would order 5 or 6 at a time and then store them in the backyard so that when they were ready to pull one off, they could pull one off the shelf and use it for the project. And did it matter to us if that invoice date on that tank that they bought a while ago was prior to notice to proceed? Well, no, it doesn't matter to me as long as the tank's still in good shape. So that's the sort of exception to that. But there is the understanding that if there is something that changes, that's custom, that changes as a part of that design review, the sponsor then, could be hanging out there for that. So as long as the sponsor's going into this with their eyes wide open, then that's, I guess, why we allow that. So the next thing I wanted to highlight, page 14, everything has to be documented by invoices, even in-kind expenses. In-kind invoices will be reviewed for mileage and hourly rates. Last sentence there, the office understands, however, that these rates will vary across the state, so no pre-approved mileage and labor rates are provided. However, the sponsor will need to document these rates used should there be a need to review their reasonableness. I've gotten that request several times. Everyone would just love it if we could produce a list of, this is how much I'm willing to accept per mile, and this is how much I'm willing to accept per hour. But that is brutally unfair when you look at Teton County and Sublette County versus Laramie County. And I just don't think that we need to go there. But I will review what they think is reasonable to the extent that's necessary. And typically I don't have a problem with that. People in the state are very common sense oriented, but that is one of the things I was going to just point out there. There's a list of required documentation there. Most of those items are requested prior to notice to proceed, but because they're specifically identified as necessary in the criteria, I wrote them down as a necessary double check before final payment is issued in case we get audited, and that does happen from time to time. All invoices are submitted. Let's see, will be reviewed against that notice to proceed date for eligibility. Project expiration dates are always set for December 31st. It's like 2 and a little over a half years after the funding is approved. And then so final payments need to be turned into the office by December 1st. Lessons learned on the first year I took this program over. A lot of the stuff was going to expire December 31st, and I was still getting pay requests 2 days before Christmas. So the very next year, I put in a December 1st deadline with the idea that that would give me time to review the final payment request. And then if there was anything that was a problem, I'd still have time to go back and fix it and not get ourselves into problem with the auditor's office. So that having been said, for those projects that are determined by the project sponsor to be a public project, and will still require the 41-day advertising period, you have to back that 41-day advertising period back. So that makes it early October to complete the project and do the advertising before you can meet the December 1 deadline. And to help the project sponsors, I go through my database every year and double check with David to make sure we're both on the same page. And then I'll send out a letter in April or May-ish, depending upon how new applications are finishing up, but to all of the project sponsors with active projects. And I list all of the projects that they have coming up for expiration that year, figuring that that gives them another month or two to finish up design and still meet the very limited construction season window in our Wyoming climate. So I think that's it. That was a lot.
One question.
Sure.
On your as-built drawings, even if it's just a small project, and you can give them a letter of certification, but do you guys still require some type of, even if it's a simple as-built drawing?
It can be one or the other. So as an example, if it's a well that the NRCS did, and then NRCS can go off and just redline the changes and sign it, that's sometimes easier for them than putting a letter together. Other times, in other counties, they will have engineering firms bundle up a bunch of small water projects and design a whole bunch of them. And then rather than paying that engineering firm to come around and inspect them all, they'll have the NRCS office come out and provide a certification letter on their projects because the engineers from NRCS are willing to do that. So then rather than getting individual signed as built, we'll get a letter that says, I reviewed this project and it looked great and it's functioning. And we try to keep a little bit of flexibility there, but we do need the independent verification to say that it was constructed and it's working.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments for Jody? Yeah, Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a few questions for you, Jody. First of all, nice job on the document. A 15-page document describing a whole project or whole program is wonderful. The first question is about the public benefit. So is it mostly conservation districts that apply as the entity?
Yes.
And but the projects themselves are actually on individual ranches. Is that correct? That the end
Currently.
user is a rancher, for example, a stock watering pond. That's it. It's a rancher that receives the benefit.
Yes.
The rancher pays the cost, correct? The conservation district isn't participating. It's the rancher and the state that combined pays for the project.
It depends on the project, but that is a frequently the way it works. Yeah.
So the new November 15th deadline, you brought that forward. That's good. I like that, but my question is, why didn't you bring it forward in October? We brought the consultant selection process in, so we have hard numbers on the big projects, and yet the little projects were still coming in. You said you'll at least have a ballpark of where we're at by the time we meet in December. Why wouldn't the agency director just bring that deadline forward to the point that you have hard numbers? Just as a thought.
That's a good question. I think at the time we were thinking, we won't necessarily need to have gone through the sort of detailed micro level analysis on every single project. What we would instead need is to go through, okay, I have 65 applications and this many had 35,000 and this many requested. So what we really need to do is just go in and say, first look, here's what the total request was, and worst case scenario, this is what it's going to be needed to fund them all. And that would give the districts, a little more time in the summer and that kind of stuff to meet with the landowners and review everything and get the applications put together, but still give us the time to get the commission, the information prepared for you guys. So
last year you developed a criteria, which you've formalized now, and you rank the projects all the way down. I think you put them in categories. My question, and yet we fund almost every project. There's only been one or two that we cast aside in the last couple of years, as I recall. Given the fact that we're benefiting specific ranchers with this program, wouldn't it make sense? And maybe I should be asking all of us here, why are we funding every project that comes in? If she has a perfect ranking process, wouldn't it make sense for us to scrutinize the top 30 or 40 or 50? And I mean, obviously, if a project is way at the bottom, meaning it's electrical line drug into the property for a well or something like that, that may not rank as high. If we're scrutinizing projects, why aren't we scrutinizing that a little tighter? I guess is my question for the group here is, if once we get her ranking, we ought to identify how much money we want to invest in the small water projects versus how much do we want to save for the larger projects if we start getting tied on things. So my question is, are you going to continue to do that ranking for us? And then in December, I think that we ought to scrutinize what project, where do we cut that off at? And then literally we'll put that number in the omnibus bill and go to the legislature with it. So I think we'll be asking that question in the fall.
One clarification, sorry for the interruption. The one clarification being by the December timeline, I probably wouldn't have rankings for you yet. So I would have, this is the total request, but I would not have necessarily had a chance to go through every one of those projects and divide them among the categories, because that's the part that does take some time.
That's back, Director Gephardt. But if we want to scrutinize these, maybe we don't. Maybe we want to pay all of them and just keep them rolling. But if we did want to scrutinize them, we would need in subsequent years Jody's deadline to come forward so that we would be able to have that prioritization list in our December meeting in order for us to make that decision.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Simpson, I would agree with that. One thing that has occurred, at least in the last couple of years, is when we present it, it seems like the body, Select Water and the commission, just pick a number that they feel comfortable funding for the small water program this year. And then it would be to us to say which of these projects will fall under that cap. So last year, I think we just landed on 1 million in new development and 500,000 in rehab. And it kind of seemed like at that time that that's kind of a guideline to expect every year, that we're going to fund $1.5 million for small water. And so I think that we do I think the body does evaluate how much they want to spend on small water. And then it's to this priority to figure out what of these projects can be funded by that. So I think there is a little bit of that already. It's not looking at the specific projects as much as it is the dollar amount that we feel comfortable funding every year. And that's, I think, what Jody was alluding to, and part of her discussion is, if that were the case, say we had $2 million in applications, but the body chose to only fund 1 million of it, then we go to that priority and we have that cutoff that, say we have 900,000 funded or applications that fall within the first 3 categories. And we're going to say the first 3 categories is the cutoff. And so we would have a balance of 100,000 going next year, rather than going up to that bump of whatever this body decides they want to fund. We say, okay, we can fund all the projects in this category, and then we'll carry over the remainder of whatever falls under that. So we do a little bit of that already. Is that the way you're thinking?
Mr. Chairman, I think that the body ought to be thinking that over. That seems to be a little bit opposite of what we're doing with the large projects. And are we comfortable with that? And if so, we'll just carry on with the policy. But if you feel like we need to scrutinize that a little tighter, then we would need to change the way we do business.
Senator Hicks.
If I may, because this is a recollection from a conference with the commission in Select Water 3 years ago when they went through criteria changes in the program at that time. So the first thing we need to understand is, back to your scenario of a private landowner and we're just paying for 50% of the cost. We don't do that. The program does not do that. And so the scrutiny comes through, there's really there's a 4-part test of the scrutinized project. And the first one, the ultimate litmus test, is you have to meet the public benefit or the project's not eligible. So the scenario that happens is XYK ranch or farm or municipality or whoever the entity is comes to a potential project sponsor and they say, I want to do the project. At that point in time, it's incumbent upon the project sponsor to make a determination whether it meets the public benefit criteria. So that's the first level of scrutiny the project gets. You come to your local conservation district and say, I want to do this. Then the next scrutiny that comes in on the project to see that it meets the eligibility of the criteria for the program and what priority it falls into falls back on the staff. And so they look at that and say, I just don't think this passed the smell test of meeting the public benefit. So that's the second level of scrutiny that these projects go through to meet the public benefit test. Then the staff makes a recommendation to the commission based on that. And the commission can come back and say, we don't think it meets the public benefit test. So there's the third level of scrutiny that goes through these process. And then the fourth level is the Select Water Committee when we appropriate the money for the Select Water, because they will bring a list of all these projects. So there's already a four-point test to scrutinize these. And the test is, does it meet the public benefit? If it meets that, then you go back to the criteria for the program. And within the criteria, it has to be a well or this or that to be eligible. And then within those criteria, then there's a priority ranking system. So I think it's pretty rigorous right now that what we do, and to a certain degree, I think there's a little more oversight on these. But you have to be able to document. And I think Jody articulated that well when she says, when she gets those applications, she looks at those and says, is it just putting a power line into a guy's place that he's going to put his machinery shed on next to his water well? So you've got to meet that public benefit test. And this is the discussion that's gone on in the past. And just because I was involved in those discussions, I believe 3 or 4 years ago, when we went back through these criteria But that's really where that comes in there to go through the program. So I think if we were going to do something, it gets into the prioritization, as to where you cut that off. And I think Director Gephardt did a good job of articulating how that would happen, as if there's just not enough money, or we choose to say, look, we're just not going to fund those low priority programs, given the financial constraint, and the flexibility is in there for the commission to make that recommendation and even deny those applications based on available funding. So I do think we need to think about it, but this has kind of been an ongoing discussion, but that's the real, that scrutiny part is there. It's just to make sure, and ultimately our job is to make sure that the commission's doing the scrutiny, and the commission's making sure that the staff is doing the scrutiny, and the staff is doing the scrutiny to make sure the sponsor has done that. So there's a lot of checks in the system before it gets to us. Does that help?
Chairman, and please don't misunderstand me. I think the program is really beneficial. I really like it. My part has not been in scrutinizing. My concern is that we're just slam dunking and he's given us a ballpark, and this will help now that we've got the deadline a little earlier. She'll be able to fine tune that. But to randomly just say we're going to do 1.5 million, regardless of how many applications have come in and whether they're great applications or poor applications, the last couple of years, I've been a little uncomfortable with that, because I'm just not sure if I say 1.5 million, where's it going to? Because we haven't seen the list until you finally have time to produce it for us. That was my biggest concern, is it seems like we're allocating funds without really even seeing the list of projects that it's being spent on.
Commissioner Little.
Well, to that degree, I'll help you with the schedule on how we do that too. I think to springboard off what these guys are saying, we see the preliminary list, and then we make a determination on what money we want to spend in December or January. That's it. And so that's why she just gives us a preliminary list in our March meeting, which you guys don't attend. Right after the session is when we actually go through and scrutinize the projects based off of that block amount of money that we put in the omnibus bill. So we kind of decide based off of that. But if we want to do, as you're talking about, Representative Simpson, and not spend as much money in small water projects, we decide that in December, but then we scrutinize them. And that's when our priority list will come into play. And then we will cut people off based off of the available funds.
Thank you. Commissioner Craig.
I have a couple of questions, and I would maybe like some examples as I'm looking through this and being new to the commission and pretty unfamiliar with a lot of the projects that maybe have been funded in the past. I see some things I'm looking at as I see, it appears to me that a lot of this money may have been historically directed toward more livestock water type of things. Maybe that may not be necessarily true, but I see in the irrigation project, maybe a limited use or availability or opportunity, particularly if you have irrigation land in an organized irrigation district. So I'd maybe like some examples of some irrigation projects that have been funded and why those passed muster for public benefit in comparison to, say, some rangeland type of projects.
Absolutely. I guess I'm trying to think about most common. My statistics that I put together on my computer, I don't have that in front of me right now, but I do a lot of diversion rehabs where the diversion's washed out or they need a new turnout out of the river. And so that involves some channel work and then a new diversion headgate structure out of the river. I do a fair amount of those. I also do a fair amount of ditch to pipe work. And the public benefit of course, the channel work with the diversion structure is you clean up the creek and you make it more efficient for them to get water out of the creek, and then they can get more water more easily, and then everybody downstream of them is therefore also able to better utilize the water that's left in the creek. So And the ditch to pipe is a similar sort of benefit. And I think that just globally, I think you could probably assign those sort of types of public benefits to all of our project categories. I think all of our project categories are inherently beneficial, but it is very important for the project sponsor who tours the project and looks at the project and knows the scope of the project and knows the landowner and the location and the health of the watershed to then put the details on paper for myself and for the commission and Select Water. But ditch to pipe, we have a lot of places like in the Bighorn Basin where it's inherently very erosive. And I'll get a call and they'll be like, oh, the ditch is about to wash off the side of the hill. And if we can line this one section right here, then, put this in pipe, then that of course makes the whole rest of the ditch more efficient. And then they can take less water and they have to push less water through the ditch because they're not trying to get past this bad section. And then everybody can have more water and use it more effectively. So I guess those are some off the top of my head examples.
So those type would be probably maybe a small system, maybe 20, 30 CFS type of system, not a large organized district under a bureau project. I'm making some assumptions with what you're saying.
That's pretty common. Yeah. Mhm. Not
Commissioner-
required, but common.
But they're not on farm.
Commissioner Craig, can you
Correct.
speak into the mic?
So those projects they're not on farm projects. They're
Yes.
okay.
That's
So
correct.
the comparison where I'm kind of going with this, it appears that maybe some of the rangeland projects would be, for lack of a better way of saying it, on ranch, but would there be only one operation involved or multiple landowners involved on say a spring development, for instance? If you increase the flow of a spring and maybe a pipeline, stock tanks or something, would one individual qualify for a project like that?
I guess taking a step backwards and looking at the rangeland projects that we do, it's bigger than just, is it one landowner? Oftentimes we're doing it on federal property, oftentimes it's on private property, but the biggest public benefit of the rangeland projects is not just that we're providing a tank that makes it easier for the antelope and the deer to get water, but primarily because those cows were previously drinking out of the creek. And we've all seen the creeks that have the, cattle hoof prints and no willows and no plants and no riparian habitat. So by getting the cattle off of the creek, then the riparian vegetation can come back. And I have actually heard stories from districts who have done projects that are pretty old now. Well, they will tell you that they have had ephemeral creeks then become full year-round streams, because what you do is you rebuild the wetland corridor and you slow the flow down and you reduce the erosion, and now everything slows down on the channel and you have a live stream that's there most of the year instead of something that flashes through because there's no vegetation to hold it back. So it's take a look at the whole picture, I guess would be the point that I would answer to that.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a couple, 2 or 3 questions here. So Jody, on page 15, where you talk about the order to have a 41-day advertising completion period, last year in the omnibus water bill that we passed, that we got rid of the requirement for advertising if the sponsor determines. So is that provision still necessary? Is that going to become something that's antiquated, seeing how we've got rid of that advertising requirement for small water project?
I think that I tried to put in there where it is required, the affidavit of publication. So I hope that it doesn't become antiquated. I still have some projects, I think up in Teton County and a few other places where they have determined the projects to be public. So not everybody.
It would only be under those cases.
Absolutely.
So I think that would be helpful to add that language for those, just for when the project sponsor determines that it is a public work, that provision comes in. The way it's in there now, it would lead you to believe that it's required for all projects, which is inconsistent with statute. So
okay, that's an easy clarification.
Mr. Chairman, then back on, I believe, when we were talking about project priorities, actually, let's go back to the beginning. So on page 7, And this gets into the ineligible project expenses. And so if we go down to number 2, flumes and measuring devices, then it says these, and actually I'm doing this for my colleague Representative Larson, who's not here today, but it says these expenses are the responsibility of the permit holder and are not eligible expenses for the program. And I do understand, I would concur with that in the case that they're aperturant to a private ditch on private lands. In other words, it's no different than on field. But what happens in the case, because we fund these through the large project, if an irrigation district come in and they wanted to do some major canal rehab and replace, we fund those for those public entities or those organized entities through the large program. And the way this is worded, would those not be eligible? So if a incorporated ditch company, or let's say an irrigation district, wanted to come in and apply for a small water project to replace a measuring flow. The way I read this, I'm confused as to whether that would or would not be eligible for funding. Because I think it goes back and it says, well, no, those measuring devices are not eligible. But yeah, we say only those that are permit holder meaning the water right holder. But the very nature of an irrigation ditch or canal company or a water conservancy district is to provide delivery. They do not own the water. They are a company that provides conveyance of that water. And so as an organized public entity, would they not be eligible to come in and then apply for funding to do those, whether it's a flume or a weir or some other flow meter or SCADA system or something like that under the small water program?
So I jump in, Jody, if I'm saying something wrong, but I know this has been debated in the past. And it was my understanding that the thought was that the program didn't want to just go fund a whole bunch of measurement devices. And it could turn into that was the fear. I don't know that I disagree that if it's part of a larger project and measurement is being replaced or rehabbed, that it would necessarily be ineligible. But I don't think that the intent was ever to just go out and install measuring devices. So I guess eligibility, if it's part of a larger project and the flume is a portion of the cost, then maybe it could be, but goes back to what is the program?
And if there was enough, let's say it's as an example, $100,000 project, and you had, $70,000 worth of, rocks, structures in the creek, and we know for a fact that's eligible, then, we would let those projects go through and assume the funding for the flume or the other source was somebody else's funds. And maybe that's a fine line to draw, but.
Probably wouldn't, it would be an eligible expense under the large program if an irrigation district come in and said that we wanted to replace 2 or 3 measuring devices. Under that program, they get a 67% cost share through the program. Wouldn't it be better to direct them to the small water program if they wanted to do 2 or 3 and say, it's a 50% cost share on that. But I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to do the demarcation between, as the large project, if we've got a canal that carries 300 or 400 CFS and we need 2 or 3, let's say SCADA systems on there.
Again, I think, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I think the way we view it, even on the larger programs, is it's not our intent to go out and fund a measuring device by itself. If it's part of a larger project, then yes, we would fund that as part of the larger project. And I would think that small water could be the same, that if it's a component of a larger project, then it could be eligible. But just to go out, I don't think even in the large project that we go out only for measuring devices. SCADA is the same way. If it's part of a larger project, then it's eligible. But we're not going to be in the business of going out and installing SCADA solely.
Mr. Chairman, then a couple of things that come up that I think that we may want to take a look at. And it got back to the criteria. So if you look at the enabling legislation, high priority projects for funding under the Water Development Commission are typically, I think the number one listed project is multiple use projects. In other words, storage that incorporates fisheries and recreation and municipal. How would, because I know Jody gets these that have under the priority system, it could be wetlands, could incorporate some irrigation and also have some public recreation. So that's a multiple use project. And under the statutory criteria for the program, those are supposed to be high priority programs, but we haven't contemplated that for the small program. And so it leaves the staff in a position of trying to pick or choose which one of those is the priority. And it gets back, I think, to what Representative Simpson was talking about. At some time, if we get budget short, and we have to then say, we're only going to fund priority 1 through 3, not 1 through 7. What happens to those projects that are multiple use projects that are more in line with the statutory guidance for the water development program as a whole as multiple use projects are a high priority? Is it something that we complicate? And I think that puts the staff and the sponsor in a difficult position to pick or choose. Because they're always going to choose the sponsor will choose the one that say maybe 10% of the benefits were derived for storage and 15% for wetlands and the rest for irrigation. They'll always say, well, no, it's just the highest priority project. And so, and this is a question for the commission, and the select water committee. Do we need to provide another project criteria for those that have multiple benefits? And I don't have my statutes out in front of me, but just having read those numerous times within the entire water development program, if you look at the statutory authorization, those were listed as, some of the highest priorities. So it's a question that we don't need an answer for today, but we will eventually probably cross that bridge where we're going to end up where we have applications and we have more applications and funding. And then what do you do with those that are actually multiple use projects that meet 2 or 3 or 4 of those priorities? Which one of those priorities do you pick then? And so I think it deserves some discussion. But anyway, it's just something as we were going through that popped in my head.
Commissioner Cott.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Hicks, I think that's an excellent idea, bringing in that multiple use idea. Many of us also represent or in our constituencies and our regions, municipalities. And, some of these things, it's hard for a municipality to get, up into that top 5 sometimes, but you have very legitimate projects. And in part of that multiple use, I'd add health and safety. The city of Green River has a drop structure on the Green River. It practically drowns people. And it's an emergency situation. And, maybe there's another funding source for that, but it brings up this, this public benefit that is a broader term, and maybe we need some criteria for public benefit. Define that a little bit. What is public benefit? And, but I think going the multiple use route makes some sense.
Thank you. Director Gebhardt, shall we move on to the next?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I just had one complexity to that as we were discussing this, and it might have been falsely done on my part, but the higher priority in my mind was developing of water for beneficial use in Wyoming. And I think that's kind of how the priority lays out. And I don't disagree, because I believe I've read it too, that multiple use in statute is a high priority. But when we focus down to this type of a program, I would pose the question is water development, where does that fit in the priority as well? To me, it's fairly high. So I don't disagree that further discussion could occur.
Thank you, Director Gebhardt. I think this discussion, we could, if we're gonna like bring it to the table and try to change the criteria, then I think maybe we need to have that on a different agenda item at a different meeting. But thanks for everybody's comments, and I think we need to move on.
Yeah, before we move on, I appreciate this. And one of our intents was to get a guidance document that we felt fairly comfortable with and get it out to the public so that they can see. I don't know if we feel that we're comfortable with this in the vein that it's going to be a living document. We understand that things will evolve and this document will change. It doesn't need commission approval or select water approval for us to put this out on the website and print some copies and get it out. I guess generally, are we comfortable enough with the document as it is to start putting it out there, or do we want to pull it back and answer some of these questions before we do that? I guess what's the thought of the body to do that?
Do you have any comments? Chairman Simpson?
Since I stirred the pot, let me give you, I really love the document. I'm fully supportive of executing and getting it out. And it'll change. Every year you're going to tweak a few things here and there, but I think Jody's done a wonderful job.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would agree with that. I think it's a really good thing that needs to be out there because we've got people going to be doing applications here, you know, right, going to be bailing into the middle of them. So the more clarity we can get on the program earlier, I would encourage the office to get it up on the website and make sure it's available to all those sponsors. I do think it provides some very good information about the program that you just can't mine out of the criteria. A little more detailed discussion. So
Thank you. That was my hope as well. I know that there's a lot of the districts are looking at November 15th deadline is coming up pretty quickly. And my hope was to get it on the website just as soon as we had this discussion.
To Gebhardt, do we need like a motion? Okay, and then there was a portion that you were going to change at last.
I think Senator Hicks had some language about the 41-day advertising more in keeping with and that's easy. I can certainly add that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Craig.
I don't want to drag this on too long, but I would like a little bit of clarification that on the ineligible land, ineligible projects, the on-farm projects. Can you give a little clarification? It seems like it's pretty self-explanatory on the irrigation side, but on those wells and so on, I'm a little confused with troughs, for instance. A trough certainly has to be on the farm and be utilized either by livestock or wildlife. So how are you splitting that? Or how are you making that determination if it's on farm or not?
With regards to the livestock watering systems, I don't make the same distinction. I look at it through a different lens, whether it be the greater project is going to benefit the watershed as a whole by virtue of the fact that we're healing the riparian areas and the plant communities are coming back for the watershed downstream of that project. I guess that's how I look at it. So it's like from everybody from here down is going to benefit at that project by virtue of the fact that these things will slowly start to improve. And as Senator Hicks did a great job of articulating, I am not the first review. The conservation districts are. And I will tell you that people in the conservation districts across the state take that responsibility very seriously. And I have already started getting calls, for applications that they're anticipating applying about in November. And I'm going to go visit one here in another few weeks because they take that responsibility very seriously. They want to make sure that the projects that they put forward do have enough public benefit that they can stand in front of you and know that they can answer for the money that they are asking for. So I guess, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it helps. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Director Gebhardt, should we move on? Thank you, Jody.
Chairman, there is only really one topic left, and that's a project update for the West Fork Reservoir NEPA. And then Jason will give a very brief update on that, and then I'll just cover a little bit of the logistics for tomorrow before we adjourn.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chairman, as you remember or may remember from back in March, I gave a little bit of an update on the West Fork Reservoir project. For those not familiar with it, that's the 10,000 acre foot proposed reservoir in the Little Snake River Basin that could potentially benefit the Savory Little Snake River Water Conservancy and the Pothook Water Conservancy District. It's gone through in previous years several rounds of feasibility studies, level 2, phase 1, level 2, phase 2. And then since that time, as I mentioned in March, some federal funding was acquired from the sponsors from the NRCS in a form of a grant, which would cover 50% of the what NRCS calls watershed planning, what everybody else calls NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act. So since March, we've had quite a bit of discussion with the federal agencies. There's basically currently 3 federal agencies involved. There will be more once we get into the NEPA process, but we've got NRCS, of course, which is a federal funding partner. We have the U.S. Forest Service because a majority of the reservoir project is on Forest Service property, and we're looking at a land exchange with the Forest Service, potentially utilizing state lands for that land exchange. And then the Corps of Engineers, where we require a 404 permit. So we've had conversations. We kind of have the sideboards of what the NEPA will look like. The NRCS has chosen to be the lead federal agency in the process, with the Corps and the Forest Service as cooperating agencies. So this is a federally led process. It's a little bit different than our normal project. Ultimately, so they've allowed us or been gracious enough to let us follow state statutes as far as the consultant selection goes, and also to be involved in the process. But ultimately, the decision is theirs on who that third-party contractor is going to be. So we pay for it. An objective third party actually does the analysis, and that would include, developing the purpose and need statements for each of the federal agencies, looking at a reasonable range of alternatives to address those purposes and needs, and then disclosing all the environmental impacts associated with those alternatives, ultimately leading to the preferred alternative, which we hope we've done our homework, and that would be the West Fork Reservoir site. So in July, so the selection team consists of the 3 agencies I mentioned, the representative of the districts, and then I'm sitting on the selection team as well as representative of the state of Wyoming. In July, we started advertising for those projects and just recently shortlisted 3 firms. They're all in-state firms. That was just done on Monday, and we provided them the RFP for the NEPA process, or what we propose the NEPA process to look like. We will be receiving proposals from those 3 firms as of about the first week of September. And then we'll interview the firms in about mid-October and hopefully have a contract in front of the commission and the Select Water Committee in November, which will then lead to the NEPA process officially kicking off probably towards the end of the year. So that's my quick update with that. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
But do you have any questions or comments for the office about Jason? Anybody have any questions or comments for Jason? Nope. All right, I guess we'll move on to the kind of the updated itinerary or whatever it is for tomorrow's tour.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Tomorrow we'll meet here starting at 8 o'clock. I believe there'll be a light breakfast and potentially coffee here. Goshen Irrigation District will be doing a virtual presentation on their tunnel starting at 8:30. Following that, Colt Rodeman with LaPrelle Irrigation District and Respec will give a short presentation on the LaPrelle Dam and where we are with that. And then we'll go to the site. We'll have a tour. We'll have a barbecue there. David Ray's he's in charge of cooking. So we'll do that. But we have a couple of vans and some other SUVs So as many people as would like to jump in, please do. We'll try to take as many as we can. Once we get out to the site, it's a very tight site, so we'll go to Air Natural Bridge Park. We'll park there and then we'll use our vans to shuttle people in. We may not get everybody there at one time. And then there's also some hard hat restrictions and we've got limited hard hats. So that may play into how many people are at the dam site at any moment. I think we have 45 hats, so we should be all right. But just some of the logistics that be patient. We'll get everybody in there, but it's just going to be a little bit of a shuttle to get in there and it'll be a little bit noisy. Well, they are releasing water. Colt has offered to take groups of 10 or fewer into the dam if anybody chooses to do that. Then other than that, we'll be around during the presentation, you'll be presented a handout. And that handout, I think you can go out with that and you can identify in real life where some of these issues are that they're talking about, hold up the pictures. And then those folks will be out on the site to answer any questions and show anybody else around too that would like. So that's what we have planned for tomorrow.
Are we exactly meeting it in the morning?
Sorry,
Where are we all?
we'll meet
meeting
here
right
at 8
here?
o'clock.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure everybody heard that.
Thank you.
Is there anything else? Any comments? Okay, we'll adjourn. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks. Thanks for coming.